Hello everyone, I'm very glad that you listened to my story. Please give me a follow and like the video if you enjoyed it. Feel free to comment and provide feedback so I can improve the sound quality. Yes, I will now continue the unfinished story. Chapter 39, Divine Auction 1. Draco laughed at Riveting Knight's silly antics. If she was able to spout such nonsense, it meant that she was definitely fine for the most part. He breathed an audible sigh of relief from that. It then hit the fellow that even though they were technically overpowered when facing other players, against other elements of the game they were nothing but very big ants. Reincarnation or not, 15 years of knowledge or not, Draco realized that the two of them had been on the verge of true death this time if not for very convenient circustances, as if some higher power wanted them to survive at the cost of consistency. May I ask my lord if the fusion was successful? Madame Carey ventured with a smile. Even though she knew the answer, she still wanted to ask just to be sure. Yes, it was a success thanks to your help, Madame Carey. Draco replied while bringing Riveting Knight up to her feet. She shook off her dazedness and returned to her idle stance, which made even a high-tier individual like Madame Carey feel a slight bit of danger. Haha, nothing like that, my lord. I was just trying to help you out in the name of the church. Madame Carey laughed gaily. Draco gazed as Madame Carey with admiration and respect, a feeling mirrored by Riveting Knight who stood beside him. How could he not understand her words? She had used her personal privileges, which might get her into trouble, in order to have Draco owe her a favor, which she unhesitatingly passed to the Church of Light. Draco might be a rank 1 Avenger currently, but his future was limitless before he got the divine treasure chest. Now however, with these acquisitions, it was to the point where gods would feel envy. A favor that could be redeemed from such a talent in the future was an enormous boon, even more than receiving the dragon soul. Instead of keeping this to herself, she passed on the right to utilize this favor to the church. What devotion! What selflessness! What was even more amusing to Draco and Riveting Knight was that the church would only use this favor when the next Great War broke out. After all, who was to say that Draco would give a shit about the war? A power like him could roam the lands freely, and even the Demon King would send him gifts to prevent his participation. Utilizing the favor to have him participate would increase the chances of survival for the human race by more than half. Still, if the church knew that Draco's whole world domination plan hinged on the Great War, how would they feel? After all, it was through participation in the Great War that Draco realized that he could accrue enough benefits to reach the level cap and break through the void. The Great War was a large-scale conflict that erupted between the human and demon races once 1,000 years had passed between the last one. The devil race usually sat by the sidelines and played a role similar to what Draco did for the two outposts in the War of Attrition. They would provide weapons and mercenary assistance to the weaker side at any point in time and extend the conflict as long as possible while profiting. That was why the devil race was despised, but tolerated. You never know when you might need their help in a future Great War, so it was better not to burn all bridges. The Great War was not fought in the way you were thinking. Humans were, unfortunately, the weaker side in this conflict, since demons were born with natural advantages. They also lived in a parallel plane that had much less resources, so they had to fight from day one in order to survive. This made them ferocious, cunning, and very battle-hardened, unlike most humans who lived banal lives while leaving the combat stuff to others. This meant that, to describe the Great War in game terms, it was a siege defense. The goal wasn't to wipe out the invader but last long enough for the hidden powers to band together and seal the breaches the demons used to enter this plane. Since the hidden powers couldn't take part in the fighting, it was left to all the other combatants in the world to fight off the never-ending waves of vicious and clever opponents who had the same skills as they did, but utilized them better. As you could imagine, the survival rate was abysmal. Humans hated demons with such burning passion that it was imprinted in every single person's bloodline. Demons hated humans too, but not for the same reason. The hate was simply due to the fact that they felt humans were retards. A world with such lush resources and abundant worldly energy, yet you couldn't subdue it? Have you seen the demon realm? It was half barren wasteland and half hellish inferno, yet we were able to survive. You couldn't even develop much with all that was around you. Then you didn't deserve to have it. The number of demons compared to humans was almost 7:1. Since every demon was a fighter by nature, it further put humanity in a tough spot since only a minority were adventurers or fighters of any kind. The rest were mundane or trade skill individuals. There was no way Draco and Riveting Knight would be missing such a party. The next Great War was about 2.5 years away in real time. Since 1 hour in real time was worth 4 in Boundless, it meant that it would be 10 years within the game. Authors note, when they say, 15 years of past life, 7 years of past life etc., they're referring to boundless time. Real time hardly passed, otherwise wouldn't the Lucifer lineage have long sorted out their issues and come for their now world popular prodigy? In their past life, all they could do was hide and fight pitched battles while praying for intervention more often than not. All players had been caught off guard, since logout was prohibited during the event. This time however, they were equipped to take advantage of this heavenly pie. There wasn't nearly enough living things to kill in their plane to help them reach level 400, but during the demon invasion, experience and loot gains for killing the enemy faction were more than doubled. With enough effort, they could reach the level cap if they played it right. After all, how did Richmond reach where he was currently? The Undying Fart had participated in multiple great wars. Without even partaking in the actual fight, his level had risen to the point where the next great war would see him reach the cap easily. For some, this war was a calamity. For others it was an opportunity. This was what separated common people from the ones destined to lord over everything under heaven. Would my lord and lady wish to attend the divine auction? Madame Carey offered, bringing Draco out of his reverie. Draco remembered that the divine auction should be starting in a few minutes and nodded. After all, even though he had traded off all his dragon's blessing potions for a divine treasure chest and 100 reputation with the Church of Light, he still had to monitor the sales of the Dragorugio sets. Alternatively, he could sell the design for the set as well as the potion, but he held off on that for now. It would be much better to trade it with a race other than humankind, since it was established that human resources weren't able to handle the stuff Draco could bring in yet. We surely would love to. Please lead the way, dear madam. Draco replied while doing some calculations. In his past life, he had been unable to visit the divine auction till later, which he regretted greatly. Putting aside this whole event of his creations, the other items put up for sale were great in their own ways. Draco might have lucked out to create 2 absolutely unique items, but one must remember that the key to their high value lied solely in the help that the dragon's soul provided. Without it, the items wouldn't even have possessed the right to be in the Cario Continent monthly auction, much less the divine auction. Madame Carey snapped her fingers once again, returning the whole crew to her office. Once there, the aide took over and led Draco as well as Riveting Knight to the highest VIP room that was usually unoccupied during most events like this. It was probably reserved for extremely important guests that the Church of Light, a superpower no weaker than the War Maniac Pavilion, had to respect or face the music. Inside the room, Draco and Riveting Knight were mind-boggled to see that, this too was a super mini small world. What the shit? Were super mini small worlds like cabbages nowadays, eh? They turned left, there was a super mini small world. They turned right, there was a super mini small world. Sigh. This super mini small world was about 10 square kilometers with an ambient aesthetic that was centered around the sky. Draco and Riveting Knight quite literally stood on clouds that were drifting above the ocean. The sky was blue and the sun's rays were muted in terms of heat and light intensity, so they were able to see with ease. There was a constant breeze that had normal air density instead of the expected slightly thin variation that should have existed at this height. The evil duo immediately fashioned a couch with a nice coffee table in front of them as they sat down to watch the auction. A few clouds on the side converged to form a large screen, which was technically a window into the auction. The aide, who had been about to direct them on what to do, was silenced before she could even speak. Draco and Riveting Knight could see that the auction room was stuffed to the brim with different people of different races who were here to nab whatever useful items they could. All of them looked affluent to an extent, though there were the occasional few who tried to remain low-key. However, no one who was allowed to attend the divine auction was simple. Soon enough, a young girl of about 14 years of age came onto the stage with a smile. She was pretty cute, with blonde curly hair and bright green eyes. Her face was round and chubby, displaying her childish cuteness and perfect pinchability. She was the kind of daughter a father could never say no to. "Hello everyone. Welcome to this month's divine auction," she shouted while waving energetically. Quite literally everyone in the audience broke out into an indulgent smile. These were people who killed, backstabbed, and generally performed what would be called evil in our world on a daily. Yet, before this chipper little miss, they were like elder brothers and sisters who were being entertained by their silly little sister. It wasn't just the looks, but an actual ability this little miss possessed. It was gentle aura that would enable relaxation and calming thoughts to the audience when she was within a certain range of them. Why would the audience allow themselves to fall under her spell? Because there were no negative effects. Why would the church use such a naive girl as a hostess for such a grand auction? Because her aura kept the audience civil while within the church. They didn't need a fluent host who could raise prices of items with a glib tongue, because all the things sold here would gather obscene prices just by themselves. "My name is Shizura. I would like to introduce the first item of the auction," the little miss said while gesturing to an item that was being brought to the stage. When it was unveiled, the audience's eyes were riveted on it to see what item would be used to kick off this particular divine auction. Everyone cast their own identification skills that were either maxed out or completely unique. Riveting Knight didn't bother, since her means of identification were still too common. Instead, she quietly waited for Draco, who had the most superior means under heaven, to share the details with her. After identification, he transferred what he saw to her on a private message. Pavo's Guard, Tower Shield. Def, 10,000. Effect. Passive 1, Deflection, 30% of all direct damage is deflected regardless of source. Active 1, Unparalleled Defense, a metaphysical barrier of golden light manifests and possesses unlimited defense for its duration. Duration, 10 seconds. Cooldown, 1 day. The audience seemed to breathe heavily when the item came out, but Draco shook his head. On paper, this was a good shield, but it wasn't actually that great in reality. The simple fact was that epic items possessed a single passive and a single active skill. Legendary items seemed to possess 2 passive and 1 active skill, probably. Draco wasn't sure about divine items since he only received the Eyes of Cielo just an hour or so ago. Besides, the game had stated that its utility had been suppressed because it was currently trying to break his bloodline seal. If it wasn't for his perfect resonance with the item, he'd likely have less passives than he already did. On that note, this epic item had an impressive active skill and the passive wasn't bad for an epic shield. However, the duration for the active skill was crap and the cooldown was far too long. Then again, the standards of these two old monsters who had lived to an age after the Great War was naturally higher than the NPCs of this timeline. What others saw as an impressive item was just average in their eyes. "Okay everyone, the minimum bid for this item is 100,000 gold. Only increments of a minimum of 1,000 gold are allowed," Shizura stated while making an idol-like pose. "Ready. Auction start." The moment she hit the pad with the hammer, the auction began in earnest. 150,000 gold. 200,000 gold. 300,000 gold. In no time, the price of the item surpassed 500,000 worth of gold, which left the aide breathing heavily. Draco and Riveting Knight weren't too surprised, as in their past lives, they had behaved similarly same for this kind of thing. It was like owning a Ferrari Enzo then visiting to a car sale where people were fighting over a brand new Hyundai Ezra. Sure, the car was great and had many benefits in the eyes of current buyers, but after tasting the power of a Ferrari, you couldn't be excited about a Hyundai no matter what. The price soon capped at 700,000 gold, which was pretty impressive for an epic item of this caliber. The warrior who had won the item's face was flushed with exhilaration. With enough time, he would be able to develop into a true powerhouse with this item. Coming to the divine auction was worth all the trouble. Others could only look on in envy. Clearly, this fellow had a bright future ahead of him. The next item was brought out and then the next and the next. One would expect the lineup for the divine auction to be limited due to criteria, but that couldn't be farther away from the truth. Even though epic and above items were rare, those were finished products. There were a lot of epic materials and resources that were tradable here. In fact, finding legendary materials wasn't impossible in the divine auction, but that would be near the end of the auction. The divine auction never advertised the items that were to be auctioned beforehand if they surpassed a certain criteria. It made the reveal all the more intense as each party fought for it like it was the end of the world. Draco remained still during the whole time, occasionally tickling the ear of riveting knight or fondling her idly. Like a cat on the lap of its master, she purred from the attention and m.o.a.net from the caress. The aide's face was long flushed as she tried to ignore the sounds she was hearing. This was a church, for God's sake. Have some awareness. Can't you see that this little sis is a pure maiden? Why do you have to spoil me like this? For our next item, we have a unique set of weapons and armor that was crafted by an immortal adventurer. Shizuru teased with a cheeky smile. Immediately, the crowd sat up. A unique set, you say? And it's made by an immortal adventurer? Could it be? That's right, everyone. This is the creation of that Draco guy, who's probably in here somewhere. If you're out there, Draco, hi. Shizuru waved happily. Immediately, sharp glints flashed in the eyes of the audience. Before, when they looked at each other, there were hints of friendliness. However, when Draco's items were mentioned, everyone looked at the other as if to warn them. F.U.C.K off when this daddy/this mommy bids. The sets were displayed for the audience to inspect, which they did. When they saw the set equipment, the crowd held their breath. If Draco pushed his true side further, he would be able to see everyone's heart rate increase. The whole audience felt a pounding in their chests as their breathing became labored. Exaggerated reactions. Not so. What was the key difference between NPCs and players? The penalty of death. If a player died, they are ESP'd with varying penalties. If an NPC died, unless they were resurrected using special means, that was it for them. A set like the Dragorugio set, which was only semi-epic, wasn't that great enough to earn a base price of 300,000 gold. What made it so valuable was the skills and set effects. Fire was one of the most common branches of magic in the world due to its destructiveness. The Dragorugio set was obviously marketed to warriors, or at least, melee classes. What was it that melee classes feared the most? Ranged fighters. Especially mages. Fire mages were the absolute worst of the lot. The resistance bonuses on the set were absolutely ridiculous. Even a relatively weak hidden power who had specialized in fire magic/element didn't have this much resistance naturally. With this set, roaming the demon world would be a cinch, though no one considered that, of course. The minimum bid is 300,000 gold. Only increments of 10,000 gold are allowed. Let the bidding begin. Chapter 40, Divine Auction 2. 400,000 gold. 700,000 gold. 1 million gold. Soon the price reached scary levels that Draco semi-expected. One should note that the divine auction handled batch bidding differently from how one would expect it to. The typical way was to assign a gross price tag to the whole batch and let bidders bid for the whole set accordingly. However, the divine auction let bidders bid for the whole batch based on the price of an individual item. So for example, should the 1 million gold bidder win the bidding, he would pay that amount for each individual Dragorugio set for all 12 sets. This meant that Draco would be paid out 12 million gold or 120,000 platinum. For scale, 100,000 platinum was what Draco had received for clearing an outpost in the Paradise Lands, a quest that was marked a death quest because no one could survive completing it. Those who probably could complete it didn't need the rewards provided there either because they were too high level. Such an amount of money to a measly rank 1 player was enough to wreak a lot of havoc. 1,200,000 gold. 1,500,000 gold. 2 million gold. However, the truly scary part was the fact that the price kept rising. At this point, Draco knew that the value of the set was nowhere near the prices being called out, even if you took the factors that made it attractive to NPCs into consideration. So why on earth was the price still rising so viciously? Draco turned his gaze to one of the NPCs who was a stereotypical fat man with a piggish look as well as beady eyes. He was one of the most recent bidders for the set and one would wonder exactly how he intended to equip it with such a frame. When Draco looked at him through the screen, it was as if time stopped in that moment. Well, time hadn't actually stopped per se, just that Draco's eyes had pierced through time itself to create this effect. Naturally, this wouldn't allow his body to move through stop time like Dio, but he could use anything related to his eyes or his mind in this state. True sight allowed Draco to see beyond, through, and of anything and everything. While this sounded complex, it was actually very simple. Take what he was doing now, stopping time with his eyes. He hadn't literally stopped time but only seen through it. If Draco were to try and peek at the future or the past, that would be seeing beyond it. If Draco wanted to see the source of time or the flow of time, that would be seeing it. In essence, one should remember the 3 usages of the true sight passive. Seeing, seeing through and seeing beyond. Right now, Draco was trying to see into the mind of the fatman. Of the 3 usages of the true sight ability, seeing was the easiest to manage. Seeing through was moderate and seeing beyond required Herculean effort. Naturally, he had tried to see beyond in the time since the auction began, but all he got was a splitting headache for his efforts. Draco unveiled the thoughts of the fatman and ascertained why the NPCs were bidding for his item so heavily. When he did though, he was very surprised. He read the minds of the other fervent bidders and was further shocked. Immediately, he shared his findings with Riveting Knight through private messages. Eva, some of the bidders plan to use the set to appease the Demon King during the next Great War. Some also are his spies that have blended into human society since the last war and plan to destroy them after purchase. Draco. Riveting Knight was startled by his revelations but remained calm. Understood. Eva. It was certainly a point to note, but the 2 old monsters couldn't care less. Madame Carey had suspected rightly, if it weren't for the fact that the Great War was so lucrative to players, these 2 would not take part. In fact, they might act like the devils and sell their services out to both sides. Knowing there were spies and traitors, Draco wasn't going to enlighten the good guys because if they were incompetent enough to allow spies in, they deserved to suffer for it. Though, he might sell the information for a good price should it be necessary. The aide who was serving them suddenly felt her heart go cold. The sun was shining lightly on them as they sat on beautiful clouds, meaning that the area was lukewarm. Even with the rays of the sun directly on her, the aide felt like she had been thrust into a blizzard. Her body began to shiver and her heart began to pound. Her eyes roved for the source of the chilling feeling, thinking that an enemy might have broken through to execute these 2 guests. However, there was nothing and eventually, her eyes settled on the real source, her guests themselves. In that moment, the aide realized that she was trapped in a super mini small world with 2 individuals who were less than human in her eyes. No human could be that callous. Of course, one should not forget that this little miss was a naive lass who hadn't seen much of the world. All she had been exposed to was the kindness of the church. In her eyes, humans were good, demons were bad. The idea that a human could be worse than a demon was impossible, meaning that the human had to be a demon in reality. 2,500,000 gold. 3 million gold. 3,200,000 gold. 3,500,000 gold. 3,800,000 gold. 4,100,000 gold. 4,150,000 gold. 4,200,000 gold. Slowly, the price began to wind down as it reached levels that far surpassed its value. Even those who had been determined to bid to the death were flabbergasted that it could reach this high. Bro, it was just a semi-epic set, okay? Even some weaker legendary items didn't sell for this much at the price per piece, much less when considering the total price. 4,990,000 gold. 5 million gold. Once that last bid was called out, the room went silent. Even if Boundless was hyper-realistic and each NPC was unique to the point of impossibility, some rules were still subconsciously followed. In auction scenarios, minimum and maximum prices were set for goods based on rank, not actual value. Since Draco's set was semi-epic, the maximum bid NPCs could call out for a piece was 5 million gold even if they wanted to go higher. Of course, players faced no such rules, but then again, which player would make such an outrageous bid for a semi-epic item? The other competing NPCs seemed gloomy that they couldn't bid more. They didn't recognize their code-imposed limitations, thinking that it was absolutely natural to think like so. 5 million gold going once. Going twice? Sold. Shizura called out with a happy face. Even as ignorant as she was of business, she could tell that reaching the price cap was a good thing for the church. Once again, remember, Boundless was a game. Instead of having to wait until the end of the auction to receive the proceeds like in real life, it was instantly deposited into his account. Congratulations on your successful sale. 60 million gold. Draco smiled when he saw the tab representing his finances in his inventory. He was rich. Callous or not, wealth was something that would make any individual smile happily. Immediately and without hesitation, Draco transferred half of the amount to Riveting Knight. However, he was startled when she rejected the transfer. Draco turned to her to inquire as to the reasoning behind her decision. My purpose isn't to leech of you while you perform all the work. My purpose is to ascertain all your wants, needs, and goals and make sure they are achieved by any means necessary. Riveting Knight stated with a rare lucidity in her voice. I don't mind playing a supporting role in your life, Draco. As long as anything I can do can bring you the slightest happiness, I'll be happy as well. She finished with a slightly warmer tone. Draco could only remain silent in the face of her obsession. Was this how main characters in stories with a Yandere felt? He had always been slightly revolted by such characters when he watched anime in the time before his rise to power, but having won himself made him aware that it was far different in reality. Eva, why didn't you ever show your obsession in our past life? Draco asked the question that had been weighing on his mind since they reconciled and decided to be together again. If he had known she was this type of woman, he would have never doubted her. His first reaction upon viewing that scene would not be anger towards her, but towards local lord solely. In fact, it was mostly because of her reveal of her obsession that he made that earth-shattering decision to forgive and reconcile. If Riveting Knight had been coerced normally and done it to save his life because of love but not obsession, he would have forgiven her and reconciled, but not re-enter a relationship with her. After all, they both had a clean slate in this life. He would go his way and she would go hers, as friends who shared a secret more than people who were interested in one another. But upon learning that she was obsessed and made that decision, his heart broke. Obsession was a disorder that should not be underestimated. It could lead to good endings, but most of the time, it led to bad endings. Draco's desire for vengeance was one type of obsession. It had eaten his sanity and humanity away until he became what he was now. He had done evils that couldn't even be recounted because they were abhorrent. All of that he justified and laid blame on riveting night while mentally absolving himself because he was the victim in his own eyes. He had eventually won, but then wasn't he murdered? After all that fighting, just when he had realized it was all over and could focus on other things, he realized that he had been killed. If he hadn't been reincarnated, would he be able to even ruminate on all this? Riveting Night was silent for a bit before she replied. I hid my real side from you because I was scared. She curled further into Draco, as if worried that he might let go of her. You weren't as diverse as you are now. Back then, you were silly, shameless, and funny. You were all around normal except for your talent, your wit, and your extreme handsomeness. I was worried that you might detest women who were clingy as I was. Draco shook his head. You're pretty weird, Eva. You were never clingy. I used to think I was the clingy one. I always used to think I never deserved to have such a woman love me. If you remove that hood right now, I bet you that almost every other guy would agree with me too. Nothing you ever did had the capacity to put me off. In fact, if I found out you were such a psycho, I might have howled into the sky from excitement. Not everyone gets the chance to have such a perfect woman be absolutely loyal to them. Draco added while pulling her hood down. When the aide, who was absolutely lost by their conversation, saw Eva's face, her heart began thumping. Her cheeks became rosy and her legs clamped themselves shut. She had always found it weird that she was unattracted to boys, thinking it was because the ones she was exposed to were dull. She had never reacted in such a way to girls either, otherwise she would be aware of her own orientation. She was lucky the two of them were too caught up in their heart-to-heart to pay her attention. Usually, no one survived seeing Eva's face, one way or another. Eva couldn't run the risk of trouble developing because of it. Eva curled up into herself further, her expression one of guilt. I know that now. I wish I could have been a bit more brave, but I was too scared. The idea of losing you was far too horrifying for me to comprehend. She laughed bitterly at this point. However, in the end I lost you anyway. My years after that was a hellish existence of self-hate, depression and madness. I hated myself for being unable to protect your life in any other way. I was depressed because of the hatred I saw in your eyes whenever you looked at me. I was lost in madness because I knew I could never have you again. I actually tried to commit suicide 3 different times but was stopped by my fear of your death at the hands of local lord as well as the impact it would have on Sublime. I wasn't going to make both of you suffer just to take the easy way out. Draco's heart went cold. 3 different times. He had never considered such a thing himself during his hatred phase. All he could think about was how to make her suffer for her betrayal. What made Draco so uncomfortable was the fact that, had he heard of her suicide in his past life, he wouldn't have cared. In fact, he might have been angry that he wasn't the one to cause it himself. He gripped Eva tightly. Unfortunately, since they were about the same height, he couldn't totally cover her form in his. But for Eva, it was more than enough. She felt all her remaining negativity from their past life bleed away as she embraced the freedom that this new life granted them. I recognize the pain you went through, Eva. I'll never forget the sacrifice you made to protect my life from harm. I'll never forget the suffering you had to go through all that time because of my inability to understand you, who I claim to love. Draco's words were heavy in his own ears, but extremely light and fluffy in the ears of Eva. How many times had she wanted to hear this in their past life? She had fantasized about Draco knowing the truth and busting her door down, holding her in his arms and saying these exact words many times. How did it feel to have one's most desired fantasy become reality? Eva would describe it as heavenly. No matter what, I'll always be yours, Draco. No matter what. Draco nodded his head at that and returned his gaze to the auction screen. In his mind, he knew that he had finally resolved all his issues with Eva fully. From henceforth, he would never doubt her again, no matter what he was presented with. After all, she had suffered enough. For an obsessed person to betray what or who they were obsessed with was much more painful for them than it was for you. The poor forgotten aide had been silent as a mouse throughout. She was trying her absolute hardest to keep her raging hormones in check, which had kept her under the radar. Okay, that's the last of our epic items for sale. Shizura announced with another cute idol-like pose. Draco once again lamented the insane amount of content that AI had been subjected to. Clearly, Shizura didn't even understand what those poses meant in the real world, but they were hard-coded into her character. At her words, the audience became more alert, Draco and Eva included. This was where the divine auction stepped into second gear. Instead of a tray being brought up to the stage, a portal was opened up beside Shizura. Out of the portal came a large table in which an item was covered by a display case. While the general audience were rushing to identify the item, Draco immediately utilized his true sight to pierce through the space that lied on the other side of the portal. It took a bit of effort, since piercing through space was a little bit harder than piercing through time for some reason. On the other side of the portal were tables with similar designs as the one that just rolled out, about 12 of them in total. Draco could see what each of them were carrying physically, but couldn't identify them because that would be pushing his ability to the limit. The first 8 seemed to be different legendary materials. Draco saw that 3 were different plants that each looked like they'd be perfect for the alchemy, farming, and physician trade skills. One was a basin of swirling purple blood that seemed to be pulling worldly energy into its depths. It looked perfect for alchemy only. There were 2 that looked like strange metals. Both floated in their display cases, one with a bright green coloration that exuded high levels of mana while the other was pitch black and seemed to consume all light around it. Draco surmised the former was elementium while the latter was obsidian. The last 2 were both for the cooking trade skill. One was a large slab of meat that gleamed with vitality. The other was a pound of what looked like a spice. Draco was sure that he saw space around the spice begin to melt. Anyone who ate food with that spice would probably feel that wasabi was a joke. The other 4 non-trade skill items were where Draco focused his attention while he could still pierce space like this. The first was a crown that radiated kingly might even from where Draco was sitting. Draco felt the crown notice his gaze and try to suppress him. All he did in response was to activate subservience slightly and the crown began kowtowing in an almost cartoonish way. The next item was a scarlet arrow that had phoenix carvings on its shaft. The shaft itself looked like a bone of a chicken leg. Its fletching was also similar to the tail feathers of a rooster, but Draco was sure it definitely wasn't if it were a legendary item. The arrowhead was a mass of flame that brightened and darkened intermittently. The arrow also tried to command the invading presence of Draco's gaze around but was subdued after Draco directed his ability on it. While it was respectful, it didn't kowtow like the other fellow. Clearly, it was of a much higher rank within legendary items than the crown. The third item was something Draco was surprised to see. It was a map. When he tried to see the contents of the map, he was almost blinded for overexerting himself. When it was brought into the space, he would be able to see its contents since he would only be using stage 1 of the true sight ability, which was to see. The last item was. It was an egg. Chapter 41, Divine Auction 3. Draco was surprised when he saw the egg just sitting there. He was sorely tempted to see what was inside it, but couldn't because it would strain his eyes too much. Once again, he would wait for it to be revealed before working his magic on it. Retracting his gaze, he turned to the item on display right now. It was a token that had the symbol of a strange tower carved on it. Babylon Tower Token, Unique Item. Effect, activates the Tower of Babylon quest. Tower of Babylon, Unique Quest. Description, the Tower of Babylon has returned to the world. Rise through all 99 floors of unique challenges to acquire divinity. Rewards: treasure chest, based on final completion, gold, based on final completion. Draco was curious about this item. He had never heard of such a quest in his past life. The description also stated that divinity could be acquired should one reach the top, but the rewards only listed treasure chest, meaning that upon reaching and completing floor 99, one could earn a divine treasure chest. Wow! Look at the hullabaloo Draco had to go through in order to get just one divine item. Now, there was a possibility for another. How could his heart not pump like a young maiden in her bridal chamber? However, his face was locked in a frown. This was simply because even if a divine treasure chest was achievable, it would require more than Herculean effort to acquire it. Since entry into the first floor of the Tower of Babylon required a legendary token, one could only imagine how hellish it would be to reach the top. Still, it won one of the few items up for sale that Draco felt was worth his money. Hi, our first legendary item is here. The minimum bid is 15,000 platinum. Increments must be of a 100 platinum at least. Auction, start. Shizura called out with extreme excitement. Her words filled the audience with a certain fervor as bids began in earnest. 16,000 platinum. 17,000 platinum. 20,000 platinum. Lord, the bids kept increasing like they were on steroids. In the auction of epic items, gold was used, but in the auction of legendary items, platinum was used. This showed the true difference between the two tiers of items and how the natives of Boundless regarded them. Draco was silent for now, waiting for the bidding to reach its climax. 25,000 platinum. 27,000 platinum. 28,000 platinum. 29,000 platinum. 30,000 platinum. After hitting 30,000 platinum, the bids began decreasing rapidly, till it hovered around 32,500 platinum. It was then that Draco decided to metaphorically lower his zipper so these fellows could peek at what a real donger should look like. 40,000 platinum. When that bid was dropped, the whole audience became silent. Their hearts began thumping as they turned to view the room Draco and Eva were located. The display was one way, so the audience couldn't see in, but Draco could see out. Their hearts were thumping not because of the price alone, but what being in that VIP room represented. A powerhouse among the hidden powers that no one could afford to offend. Yeah, did we really try to compete with such a person? But wait, this fellow up there, why need to flex so hard? If you had called out the minimum bid from the start, no one would have dared to compete, even the church would take the loss with a stoic heart. You waited until now just to show us the weight of your wallet? Did you really have to rub in our differing circustances? While majority of the bidders felt antagonized, they kept their thoughts to themselves, or at least, that was what they thought. 40,000 platinum once. Twice. Sold. Shizura cried out while breaking into a happy dance. Wow, this auction was going so well. Draco was deducted the price instantly and his item was delivered to him. Holding the token in his hands, he observed it curiously before pocketing it. He had peeked into its core framework and found that it was sort of like a modern car key. When he got close to the Tower of Babylon, the tower would show itself. When he pressed the token against the doors of the tower, he would be allowed entry. The next few legendary items were brought out and sold for outrageous prices. Even Draco couldn't sit still with all the money that was being moved about. F.U.C.K, the Church of Light was really raking it in. One day, the auction room at the topmost level of his shop would be this popular. Draco fantasized about that day in the future. When the crown was brought out, Draco inspected it properly this time. King's Coronation, ornamental item. Passive 1, Kingly Aura, suppress all who refuse to pay respects to the king. Passive 2, King's Wisdom, boosts the health, mana, and stamina of all allied members by a factor of 3. Active 1, King's Rage, summon the Royal Guard to punish all usurpers. Royal Guard have a rank cap of 6 and are summoner rank +4. Cooldown, 18 hours. This item was perfect for NPC commanders, or guild leader players since it boosted ally strength so much without a time limit. It would be an excellent tool for war or any large-scale conflict. Draco, however, didn't need such a thing with his skills and Armageddon in the bag. The item was sold for 160,000 platinum to a handsome-looking fellow who wore mage robes. Everyone noted his face carefully, making sure to add him to the list of people not to f.u.c.k with. Next was the arrow. Phoenix Cry, Arrow. Passive 1, Sonic Wave, a high-pitched sound attack is launched the moment the arrow is shot. Only damages enemy targets within the range of 1 kilometer. Passive 2, Return, arrow will always return to the quiver of the user after being shot, no matter where it is sent. Active 1, Vermilion Fire, activate this skill to add a disintegration by immolation effect to the arrowhead. Cooldown, 1 minute. Draco's heart stilled a little when seeing the effects of the legendary item. It seemed like this particular arrow fell into the same category as his Dragon Soul. Items that were classified as legendary but should probably have divine origins. Draco wasn't sure if an arrow existed that was better than this one, but he knew he would be purchasing this arrow for sure. Whoa, this one looks dangerous. I hope the person who buys it is a kind person. If you use it for evil, I'll beat you up. Steam seemed to pop from Shizura's nostrils as she shook her fist, leaving the audience chuckling good-naturedly. The minimum bid is 45,000 platinum. Increments must be at least 2,000 platinum. Auction. Start. 47,000 platinum. Immediately, the fervor died down as everyone's words got caught in their throat. When they turned to view that VIP room, they hesitated. The arrow was good, but very few in the crowd were bowmen. Even the hidden powers had very few archers in their ranks. To most in the auction, the arrow would be a good present to butter up a hidden power or a good tool to use in the right situation. Its value didn't surpass offending a power the Church of Light deemed as worthy of care, however. Let's not forget, the divine auction was held monthly, not yearly, or infrequently. It meant that not every hidden power would attend every auction. If something they liked popped up while they were unavailable, they had 101 ways to claim it for themselves. As such, no hidden power that would have contested Draco, even with his backing, was present this time. How convenient. No one is bidding? Come on guys, don't let the arrow get taken away so easily. Shizura prodded the audience with a pout, but no one had the time to respond to her. Instead, they were giving her strange looks which made her confused. Did she do something wrong? Announce the sale. One of the other staff present told Shizura quickly with a panicked look on his face. Even if she was naive and playful, Shizura wasn't stupid. She could easily tell that she had blundered somewhere, but what wrong she had done, she didn't know. This made her feel sad, but she still did her job. 47,000 platinum going once. Going twice? Sold. Draco received the arrow for a price that would make the seller feel gloomy deep down. Such a unique legendary item should have sold for hundreds of thousands of platinum, but came down to just barely above the minimum price. Wherever that fellow was, he must be spitting blood. The map was soon brought out and displayed before the audience. Deep Vault Map, unique item. Description: this is a map that leads to the Vault of the Deeps, the treasury of the city of Atlantis. Draco's breath paused for a second, and so did Eva's. These two old monsters knew of Atlantis from both real-world lore and in-game lore. It was one of the few ways to acquire a race change in Boundless. Boundless couldn't truly be a magical second world if you couldn't experience a transformation, physical or otherwise. Atlantis was the key to the mere warrior and mermaid race for males and females. However, the god of the sea was said to have left his trident there, which was a divine item mind you, as well as most of his other possessions before receding into heaven. A map to that treasury was enviable. However, similar to the Tower of Babylon's token, whether one could get the rewards depended on a huge amount of factors that instantly eliminated almost every individual from ever achieving it. Draco ignored the bidding that was going on for it. Right now, he was memorizing the content of the map. His memory was typically good, and when it concerned his past life's memories, they were perfect. However, memorizing this map required more than that since it was just like the Babylon Tower token. In other words, the map would lead you to a checkpoint before displaying the next steps and finally act as a key to open the vault. Clearly, Poseidon wanted only a truly gifted fellow to acquire his stuff. What that meant for Draco was that he had to pierce through the map, which was already straining his mind, much less memorize it. By the time the hammer came down and the map was sold for 200,000 platinum, Draco had managed to memorize it superficially. He would definitely have to find time and draw it on a parchment himself, or it would bleed out of his mind. Not just due to forgetfulness, but the nature of the map. After all, Poseidon knew that fellows like Draco would exist. In fact, being able to retain the surface level of the content as solely due to the fact that Saelo, the owner of the divine eyes, was an apex god that Poseidon could only greet as Grandpa. The egg was soon brought out and put on display. Everyone. This is the last item for this month's divine auction and it's the most special. Make sure to bid for it like crazy, okay? Shizura teased with a silly expression and a peace sign. Drake, combat pet. Description: this egg contains the offspring of a low-rank fire dragon and a rank 7 sea serpent. Draco and everyone else in the room stood up immediately. How could the church dare to sell this? Who did they expect to buy this? This was far more valuable than his 23 Dragon's Blessing potions. Why not trade a few divine treasure chests and keep it for themselves? Hi, as everyone can see, we have the egg of a wyvern, which has a 10% chance of evolving into a low-rank fire dragon. Shizura fanned the flames of the crowd's passion with her words. What the f.u.c.k? Draco was stumped. Did she just call a drake a wyvern? Could it be that this lass brains were fried due to too much posing like an idol? Draco, my identification of the item shows this. Eva said while private messaging something to him. Wyvern, combat pet. Description: this egg contains the offspring of a fire wyvern and a rank 7 sea serpent. It has a 10% chance to evolve into a low-rank fire dragon. Draco slapped his head in understanding. He had been such a retard for a second there. He forgot that his eyes of Saelo could see through everything, and clearly, this egg had been altered somehow to hide its true content. Even though Eva's means of identification were crude, Draco assumed that no one in the audience should be able to see the true nature of the egg. Just to make sure, he read through everyone's mind before breathing a sigh of relief. The minimum bid is 300,000 platinum. Increments must be at least 10,000 platinum. Auction. Start. 400,000 platinum. 410,000 platinum. 420,000 platinum. 450,000 platinum. f.u.c.k. That's not a valid bid, idiot. 470,000 platinum. It reached a point where some bidders broke the no-conflict rule due to feverishness. Even though the item was extremely valuable, very few could bid such astronomical amounts. That limited the fight to the select few who had held back earlier on. 480,000 platinum. Whoever calls another bid will be my enemy for life. f.u.c.k, who is scared of you? 490,000 platinum. At this point, the feverishness started to tone down, but bidding wasn't over. After all, one party was able to spend 600,000 platinum just for Draco's semi-epic set. It would be foolishness to doubt the weight of these fellows' pockets. 500,000 platinum. Everyone, please give me some face and allow me to play with this thing for a bit. When Draco's voice sounded out, people initially intended to bid further because of their interest, but stopped when they heard his shameless words. Please give you face? Are you retarded? Can we even see your face that you're asking us to give it to you? We were all bidding fairly, what do you mean by give you face? Now continuing to bid would seem as if we were disdaining you, giving you reason to be offended. What the shit? Shizura didn't make the same mistake as before when the voice from that room sounded out. 500,000 platinum going once. Going twice? Sold. Draco immediately received his reward with a filthy smile. What a way to cheat the system. He might have bid for the egg but ultimately given up. After all, he only had 600,000 platinum and a little more. He had spent 87,000 platinum on the token and arrow, leaving him with 513,000 platinum. That was why once it reached 500,000 platinum for the egg, he had to suppress the bidding using his status. If the people down there saw that they had given face to a rank 1 fellow, they might just bash their heads on the wall instead of making trouble with Draco. Draco himself didn't stick around for the pointless banter. He immediately blinked out of the room with Eva, leaving a shocked aide standing there. She felt her heart drop when she noticed Eva had left, but chided herself. She wasn't up to standard. Could she compete with a powerhouse like Draco? The aide just hoped Draco would drop by again so she could see that beautiful face. That wistful expression was interrupted when she felt a pain on her neck. She rubbed that spot to feel a certain wetness on her throat that was a bit sticky. When she brought her palm to her face and saw the red liquid, her mind clicked instantly. Naturally, she screamed and fell on her bum. She'd had such a close brush with death that she still didn't even know how it happened or why she was still alive. As Draco and Riveting Knight, who had once again worn her hood, spawned in the City of Light, Draco looked at her with a strange gaze. Riveting Knight lowered her head and nudged Draco to move on in a slightly bashful way. Draco found it weird that she would spare someone who had seen her face, even if it was a naive young girl. Draco was sure that no trouble would arise from this as he had seen the flow of her mind, but Riveting Knight shouldn't have been able to do same. It meant that she had decided to run the risk of trouble developing by sparing the girl. They used the portal center to return to Cario City, noticing that it seemed a bit more lively. Instead of investigating the cause, the evil duo continued by blinking to the clearing in which the ether mine existed. There would be plenty of time to snoop around for information, but if something happened to the ether mine while they were doing that, no tears could assuage the ensuing regret. Draco pulled out his settlement building token and mentally selected the area he had chosen previously. Draco once again chose yes. Draco selected yes and expected the building to commence. Unlike real life where construction took a huge amount of time, settlements were built instantly. This didn't apply to towns and cities though, just basic tier 1 settlements. Special requirement met, divine item. Would you like to make this settlement your divine foundation? Chapter 42, Settlement Building. What the hell? A divine foundation in a settlement? Wasn't that something only lesser gods could do? Draco had definitely rejected a divine emblem, so why was he being given this choice? Because of the eyes of Sahello? So owning a divine item automatically allowed one to become a deity if they managed to tie their divine foundation down to a settlement? Was that why Madame Carey had been so ecstatic when he chose the divine treasure chest over the minor divine emblem? Wait. Could it be? Draco's mind began to whirl at really scary speeds. Could it be that those two fellows in the number 1 and number 2 spot from his past life had discovered this feature and exploited it? It was extremely possible in Draco's opinion. The reason why he thought so was because those two weren't the official number 1 and number 2. Technically speaking, Draco had been worldwide number 1 while Riveting Knight had been worldwide number 2 in terms of pure prowess. They had been shifted to number 3 and number 4 due to the unanimous assumption that skill could not overcome divine equipment. Of course, in terms of skills, everyone lauded Draco as unparalleled in the world, and those other two had been only given that tag due to their possession of divine items. Who would be satisfied with such a thing? Naturally, anyone would walk over to Draco and Riveting Knight to properly settle the statistics. However, they never did. Like turtles in their shells, they had remained in their kingdoms quietly, not rising to provocation by other players due to the fact. Draco had pat himself on the back, thinking egotistically that they were scared to fight him in terms of skills. Now, he didn't agree with his previous thinking. Draco shared his opinion and findings with Riveting Knight, who affirmed his train of thought. Unlike him, who had focused solely on his revenge, the ever-vindictive Sublime Notion had sent multiple challenges to the two of them, which they always replied with gentle refusals. "Are you going to do it?" Riveting Knight asked while staring at Draco through her ever-dark hood. "Nah. It's too much of a stretch," Draco answered. For that matter, Draco didn't mind if Riveting Knight kept her hood up or not, since he could see through the darkness and capture her beautiful face 24/7. "Too much of a stretch, you say?" she queried with a raised eyebrow. "Well, yeah. Ever since I'd reincarnated, I've been lucky in everything I do. If it were before, I wouldn't have thought much about it, but now, with knowledge of the lineages and the fact that our world, our universe, isn't as normal as we thought, I'm a bit worried. I've never really believed in anything like karma or the like, but balance will always be met one way or another. Too much good will be offset by an amount of bad to render everything equal." Draco's heavy tone made Riveting Knight feel cold. It was something that had tickled the back of her mind when she found out just how great Draco's first days in Boundless had been, but would things always be so lucrative? Let's not think about it too much. Whatever happens, will happen, and we can only rise to the challenge, Riveting Knight suggested with a confident smile. "Yeah, that's the way to go," Draco agreed with a nod. Returning to the settlement building confirmation pop-up, Draco selected no. He didn't want to be tied down to one settlement in exchange for power. Sure, he would become invincible within the area, but externally, he would be weaker than normal. Even a divine emblem would be a much better method to reach divinity than this. Draco decided to have the settlement built immediately, and the funds were deducted from his inventory. First came the foundation. The earth started terraforming rapidly. It became a lot more flat and bare. Squarish holes were dug in a linear fashion. Some of these holes were larger than others, and each of them was equidistant from the other. It was like watching a fast-forward of a construction video. Soon, scrambled sounds of hammering, sawing, and swearing came out of a sudden cloud of dirt surrounding the expanse of the settlement's land. In no time, a fully constructed settlement was placed before the evil duo. Draco walked into the settlement and called up the screen for it. Settlement name, unnamed. Loyalty/upset, 100/0. Gold, 0. Worldly energy, 3%. Tax rate, 5%. Population, 0. Personnel, 0. Food, 100. Lumber, 100. Stone, 100. Metal, 100. Prestige, 0. It was as he expected, as pathetic as possible. In the world of Boundless, the city building aspect wasn't as simplistic as those in typical FIVR games of today. It wasn't as simple as paying money and having everything done for you. It required a much more pragmatic and hands-on approach. One would need to secure trade skill workers to build properties, train one's own army or hire mercenaries for defense, acquire farmers, lumberjacks, quarry workers, and miners for resource harvesting, among other things. However, these were solved with some difficulty that didn't make things too strenuous. One could also appoint an NPC mayor to handle these things while away. Once the settlement reached city level, a mayor would be compulsory, as most players wouldn't have the politician class. Still, the greatest headache when managing settlements wasn't resources, defense, or development, it was population. Exactly where the F.U.C.K was one supposed to get people from. Unless the AI required it, new beings wouldn't spawn unless through the natural process, which was procreation. One could say that they could attract people from around the world, but that was bullshit. Did you expect people to leave cities and towns that they were born in for your shabby settlement? What at all could you offer them? Many player guilds had suffered through this headache for years in Boundless, struggling to make their settlements into towns. In fact, no player guild had managed to reach that level until Update 5 in the previous timeline, even Draco himself. However, with the coming of Update 5, a new method was developed. Yep, you guessed it. If we couldn't attract people into our settlements, we will make our own people. As such, the era of debauchery was born. This was around the time that r.a.p.es escalated like crazy. Rena's brutal assault occurred around this time as well. Draco didn't want to remember that time too much. An insane amount of evil had occurred at that point, some which he had performed himself. Looking back, he realized that he was less of a cold and calm fellow, rather more of a monster at the time. Obsession with anything was usually a bad idea. However, Draco and Riveting Knight didn't have the luxury of Update 5's child-rearing mechanic to kickstart the growth of their settlement. Still though, Draco had an idea of how to get things in motion. He predicted that he should be able to hit Kingdom tier before Update 3, much less Update 5. Draco assessed the completed buildings in the settlement. There were a few cottages that were of an average size and medieval design. They were built with wattle and dog for the walls, also possessing one entrance, 2 floors, and a thatch roof. Each building was whitewashed and looked clean. Draco wasn't interested in checking the interior, as he wouldn't be living in such a house. These well-built cottages were for more important members of the population. Where the majority would live in were a few large longhouses. They were mostly built with wood but also had thatched roofs. Draco already knew the interior of these buildings since he had slept in one during his time as a low-tier member of Dark Row. It was like a barracks but a bit cleaner, more spacious, and there was more privacy. There were much smaller rooms that were divided by very thin and hollow walls, which didn't do much to prevent sound from going through, but at least one was able to change without everyone seeing their groin flopping about. Apart from that, there was one blacksmith shop, one apothecary, one hospital, one warehouse, one granary, one farmyard and lumber mill near the outskirts of the town, one stable, one general goods store, one barracks/guardhouse and one mayor's hall. Most of these buildings were unsurprisingly unpopulated. They looked like they were able to begin functioning the moment human being occupied them. The trade skill buildings were filled with pre-made equipment and even some raw materials. The guardhouse had some common weapons and armor lined up in the arsenal for potential defenders to wear. Draco and Riveting Knight walked up to the mayor's hall and took in the sight. It was less of a hall and more like a small mansion. It was built with pure stone and looked fortified. There was a gate, walls, and even a garden within the property. Draco and Riveting Knight walked inside the manor and took in its layout. There was a foyer with stairs that lead to the second floor. Beyond the foyer on the ground floor was the courtyard, in which a magically enchanted fountain stood smack dab in the middle. The corners of the courtyard had a more vibrant garden that wasn't limited to just grass. Beautiful varieties of flowers swayed to the gentle breeze, radiating ambience and peacefulness. To the right of the foyer on the ground floor was the parlor, which was the reception room for important guests. To the left of the foyer on the ground floor was the dining hall. The doorway behind the dining room led to the kitchen, which was arguably the largest room in the manor. Climbing up the stairs to the upper floor, one could see that the area was marked as private. The bedrooms were here, one for the mayor and a few others for his family or concubines. There was an office near the end of the hallway that was the executive center of the whole settlement. All in all, Draco was satisfied with his new settlement. After exiting the manor with Riveting Knight, the two stood at the entrance to the settlement, staring at the unimpressive palisade walls. Even the gate to the settlement looked like it could be smashed in by a reasonably strong fellow. Riveting Knight gently caressed Draco's hair while whispering in his ear, "You can't run away from it forever." Draco sighed, wishing that she wasn't right. Draco had put off naming the settlement as that would finalize everything. Naturally, that meant that another game announcement would be made. If players worldwide were curious about him before, they would be antagonistic now. "What should we call it?" Draco asked with a frown. Riveting Knight seemed to ponder the question for a bit. "You should give it a name with meaning to you. It's our first settlement in our new life." Draco thought for a bit before turning to Riveting Knight and grasping her chin in his hands. "The only meaningful thing that followed me into this timeline is you, Eva. I'll call it Vita." Author's note: Eva's name in Hebrew means life. It has to do with Amaterasu's bloodline ability, similar to Draco's name and his bloodline ability. Vita means life in Latin, hence the significance in this scenario. Riveting Knight's heart began to race in her chest. Her cheeks flushed and her whole body felt like putty under Draco's intense gaze. She clung onto his arm like a love-struck teenage girl who couldn't imagine life without her boyfriend. Anyone from the previous timeline who had known this woman would think she was a twin or something. That vile and evil woman couldn't possibly have such normal emotions. Once Draco affirmed his decision to name the settlement, the feared announcement was blared out of the system. Player Draco has created the first player-owned settlement, Vita. Players can now visit the settlement to help foster development. Bonuses are given to all trade skill players who work in the settlement. Settlement has a 20% bonus gold and experience reward for players who function out of it. Draco and Riveting Knight tilted their heads at that. According to their memories, no real bonus had been given for building the first settlement aside from an announcement. Then again, it might be that players in their past life had taken so goddamn long to build one. This reinforced the notion that the AI rewarded feats that far surpassed its own estimates. The evil duo were satisfied with the bonus though. If players hadn't wanted to join Umbra before, even with the impressive guild hall and rank 7 shop, they would definitely indenture themselves now. Since it had no benefits to NPCs, it meant that they wouldn't get to grow the population faster than they predicted. "I leave the guild in your hands, Eva. I'll be going to do a unique quest after I pop back into the castle to play with that succubus," Draco told Riveting Knight with a gentle smile. "Go. If by the time you return this guild hasn't reached tier 3, I'll display my face to the world." Riveting Knight replied with a look so hard that it could smash diamond. "I know." Draco knew his woman. If she said she would do it, she would do it. One should not forget, all the knowledge Draco possessed that made him overpowered in this timeline, she possessed as well. There were many ways she could get the guild up to that standard while Draco was partaking in that unique quest. Before that though, Draco's face became little rigid as he gazed at the location of the ether mine. Naturally, he planned to use his divine eyes to see the Dragoness said to reside within the mine. If she was a below supreme rank, he would be able to see her by using the see ability of true sight. If she was supreme rank, he would need to use see-through to pierce through the mental barrier that had prevented Riveting Knight from going further in. However, if she was god rank, Draco would need to see beyond, and that would be too strenuous for him at the moment as a measly rank 1 player. However, if the previous 2 true sight sub-abilities failed to see trough, that would be confirmation enough. Draco took a deep breath before trying to see into the ether mine. It was easy to see into the mine itself, as if he were there himself. There were rows of prism-like crystals that contained something bluish-green in them. The colored mass swirled within the crystals like a whirlpool, mesmerizing the eyes and the mind. The deeper Draco went into the mine, the lower the number of crystals, but each of them had a much more intense L.U.S.ter than the ones above them. When Draco reached the bottom, he saw a shield-like construct that resembled the scales of a fish. The shield was colorless, making it impossible to see by traditional sight. When Draco tried to see the other side of the shield, all he got was a rebuttal for his efforts. Hardening his expression, he tried to see through the shield, but his attempts failed once again. At this point, his heart began to thump vigorously in his chest. There was no doubt about it, that was a god-rank dragoness down there. She was probably injured and recuperating from the last war of the gods, and had missed the missive to retreat into heaven. A god-rank dragoness. The real deal? Even his dragon soul was probably a remnant of a god-rank dragon's soul, Draco had reasoned. A mere remnant had led him to possess the means to acquire a divine item. What benefits could a live dragoness bring him? When he shared this with Riveting Knight, she nodded her head and told Draco to leave it to her. She would research on the identity of the female dragon down there and share her findings with him. Sigh, how good it was to have capable partners. At that, Draco blinked away from the settlement, leaving everything in the hands of Riveting Knight, who had began by summoning the 5 generals. When Draco reappeared, he was within the walls of his castle. As he stood in his foyer, the maids who had been shuffling about were startled at first, then ecstatic. One of the cuter ones, who looked like she'd be the type of little sister one would spoil, came up to Draco. "Hello, my lord. Would you need anything from us?" she asked gently with a curtsy. Draco couldn't resist the urge to ruffle her hair, to which she seemed to like. "Bring some refreshments to my room please." As he was about to blink away, he suddenly remembered something else. "Also, bring the succubus to my room as well. Make sure her body is clean from top to bottom." One shouldn't forget, this was the medieval era. One thing most media failed to mention about the medieval era was how much people stank. Wearing armor all day didn't do much for hygiene. Of course, players weren't subjected to this yet, but the NPCs were. Baths were taken infrequently in this era and Draco wasn't fond of smelling some sardines while he was having fun. When he appeared in his room, he slowly removed his armor, ogling his body as he did. The narcissistic fellow was free to let his real self out. Words from the author. So, this is the last but one chapter of the filler segment. Next chapter will be R18 stuff, so bring your ID cards before reading. The next arc, Flora and Fauna, is pretty long because it's a self-contained story within the story. Like a side quest that's one player only. Just to give you a heads up, this arc will be a mix of horror, non-stop battles and in-game politics, a battle of wits in a way. There will be IRL segments that would feature extremely dark stuff, even more than the previous one. Also, there will be interludes with Eva and how she builds up the guild while Draco is away. Also, the biggest teaser, during the Flora and Fauna arc, the first guild war will occur. Chapter 43, R18 The Taste of a Succubus. Draco observed himself for a few seconds, marveling at how one human being could look so fantastic. He really lamented on behalf of all the women out there who could look but not touch. The fellow was so deep in his own world that he didn't notice when the cute servant had arrived with a tray of refreshments as well as Zane in tow. Zane herself looked demure at this moment. One couldn't reconcile the confident and sharp-witted leader of the hamlet with this woman who seemed to be gentle and soft-hearted. She moved behind Draco and pulled him to a single-seater sofa in the room. Draco allowed himself to be led, as he was sat and waited upon. At this moment, all he wore was a pair of men's breeches. His body was bare in every other way. Even though he wasn't muscular, there was no excess fat. He wasn't as skinny and boundless as he was in real life too. There were lines that defined his abs, chest, and shoulder blades, like an architect drawing the plan of a building. All that was left was to fill it up with the necessary materials. Zane first took a towel from the now stocked wardrobe and soaked it in hot water. Quietly and deftly, she wiped Draco's body down. Draco allowed her to take the lead this time, because he didn't want to embarrass himself. What a joke. How could he compare his few years of sleeping with women to the knowledge of a succubus on sex.u.a.l matters? Sure, Maria had abused a godly amount of skill and technique into his mind, but that wasn't going to impress the succubus. Rather than prove his mediocre skill, he would rather let her do her job. Zane eventually wiped down his whole body except his groin area. She came to his front side and got onto her knees, gently pulling down his breeches, releasing the beast from its cage. Zane's eyes gleamed with interest and slight marvel. Who would have thought that this fellow would be quite well endowed? Draco had an impressive member that was roughly 3.4 inches flaccid, a number Zane was instantly able to grasp with one look. A succubus bloodline trait perhaps? His girth was also an impressive 4.9 inches flaccid. Zane retracted her intense gaze and returned to her demure demeanor, wiping away Draco's groin area gently. When dealing with the shaft, she stretched it out and wiped the length of it with gentle yet firm motions. Her soft hands held onto his tip, dexterously caressing it under the guise of cleaning it. What frustrated Zane was that there was no reaction to her teasing. Normally, a man should be raving mad just by looking at her clothed body. She was immensely impressed by this fellow when he showed only a basic interest in her. So far, she only knew of 2 people who could resist her charms head-on. She didn't show her frustration though, her expression only stated that she was going to overcome this challenge no matter what. Her pride and dignity as a succubus was on the line here. Draco watched her with an even expression, but inwards, he was chuckling. To try and make a control master feel anything? Unless he wanted it to, everything she did was akin to pouring a bottle of water into the ocean. Zane got hands-on when she realized that in order to make her new master reach climax, she would need to drop all pretenses. Her soft hands grabbed his D.I.C.K with an easy motion, her left hand holding his shaft while the right grasped the glands. Her ambidexterity was displayed as both of these hands began caressing his member with differing movements. It was like tasting the food of a master chef. The seamless and extremely precise movements coordinated with each other to create sensations that didn't clash with each other, but harmonized perfectly. Of course, Draco had dropped his body of godliness. There was no point in being serviced if he was going to feel nothing from it in the end. He had to admit, Zane's skill was on another level. Draco had never known that such sensations were even possible before today, but the extremely deft hands of the succubus showed him the way. Zane looked into the eyes of Draco, her attractive face morphed into an expression of enjoyment and lust. This further enhanced the pleasure Draco felt, as nothing was more alluring than a partner who loved pleasing you. Zane stroked his shaft and kneaded his glands, her movements lubricated by the pre-C.U.M that began leaking from the tip of Draco's rod. The natural lubricant was like giving wings to a tiger. Zane was able to move her supple palms over his sensitive D.I.C.K and increase her tempo while maintaining the same effect. Draco had to admit that anyone inexperienced in the pleasures of sex would have blown by now. Even he himself felt his resolve weakening under the efforts of this dark-skinned beauty. Zane paused her handjob to pull down the frilly chest piece that held her amazing brie.s.ts in place. Once the melons were out, Draco's mind blanked for a second. Such a beautiful pair of tits. Her A.R.E.O.L.A weren't large, despite her above-average brie.s.ts. They were small spots of slightly darker brown that blended seamlessly with her caramel skin tone. Her A.R.E.O.L.A didn't have any bumps as well, seemingly as smooth as her unblemished skin. Whoever designed the succubus decided to factor in appearance solely, without leaving even an inkling of reality in her. She was too perfect physically. Her N.I.P.P.L.Es weren't huge, but not small either. They were just the right size for one to enjoy looking at them, as well as relish sucking on them. Draco wasn't much of a brie.s.t lover, but damn, these tits were god tier. Zane shook her chest provocatively in front of Draco, making the fellow follow their movements with the eyes of a hawk. Zane might not show it, but Draco's reaction made her so pleased that she felt extremely excited for the rest of the service. She grabbed her beautiful tits in her hands and brought them to Draco's hard rod, which stood at a solid 7 inches in length and 5 inches in girth. This was the perfect size in most cases, as anything bigger wouldn't pleasure females, but cause pain instead. Those myths about 9-inch D.I.C.Ks being godlike were just idle fantasies. Naturally, that meant that when Zane enveloped his P.E.N.I.S with her soft tits, the tip poked out with a bit of shaft left over as well. Not even her lovely D-cup Brie.S.Ts could smother this monster. She marveled inside as to how a human could have this much power in their groin. It was mostly orcs, giants, and such races which had males with unreasonably large P.E.N.I.S. Zane transformed into her succubus form at this point, her horns, tail, and eyes morphing, leaving her nails and wings hidden. Those would only get in the way of her mission. She began rubbing Draco's member in between her soft tits gently, allowing his leaking Cooper's fluid to act as the necessary lubricant. She twisted and turned her chest in different angles in order to pleasure Draco, to which the fellow couldn't help but twitch from. He was struggling to keep his voice in, but he knew he would suck u.mb soon. This succubus was too godly. When there was sufficient lubrication, Zane hit second gear, as she began thrusting Draco's P.E.N.I.S through her cleavage with vertical motions. She alternated between moving her whole upper body up and down, mimicking the feeling that Draco was penetrating her Brie.S.Ts. She would also rest her upper body and move her hands, which had cupped her Brie.S.Ts, up and down on Draco's D.I.C.K, which was the traditional method of giving a tit job. Her timing in switching between these two variants was impeccable. Just when Draco thought he was hitting his limit as she cascaded her tantalizing Brie.S.Ts up and down, she would switch to another method and delay his orgasm. Zane lowered her neck and caught the tip of Draco's D.I.C.K in her mouth, rolling it about with her tongue. Once Draco felt her warm and moist orifice on his D.I.C.K, he felt like his brain was about to short-circuit. Zane never paused in her movements with her Brie.S.Ts. She stuck to pleasuring Draco through moving her Brie.S.Ts up and down with her hands so that she could remain sucking and licking on his glands, which was the most sensitive part of the penis. Draco had to close his eyes and forcefully think of uninteresting things to fight back his coming explosion. He could use body of godliness to reduce the sensation, but that would be meaningless. He wanted to resist the feeling of orgasm while experiencing the whole range as sensations as long as he could. Zane was impressed by his resilience, but laughed inwardly. She increased her tempo and removed her Brie.S.Ts from the equation, using only her mouth. She bobbed up and down Draco's D.I.C.K, deep-throating him with no gag reflex whatsoever. Draco could feel his D.I.C.K hitting the back of her throat and even slightly penetrating into her gullet. Her eyes had misted over with pleasure and L.U.S.T as she relished this feeling from the bottom of her heart. There was nothing compared to having one's throat assaulted by a D.I.C.K to a succubus. Zane could feel her body shivering from expectation and pleasure as she devoured Draco's cock. Draco also began twitching heavily as his D.I.C.K began to throb powerfully. Each movement by Zane made the throbbing increase in frequency and intensity. He could feel something hot begin to climb up his shaft slowly, aiming to burst out at the pinnacle moment. Zane could also feel the intensified throbbing of the D.I.C.K in her mouth and felt raw excitement well up in her. Like a shark that had smelled blood, her movements became more fierce and demanding, as if saying she wouldn't stop until she was given her reward. Her efforts paid off when Draco grunted loudly, his throbbing D.I.C.K bursting with a hot and sticky fluid that traveled right down Zane's throat. Draco's C.O.C.K twitched powerfully, each spasm sending waves of SEM.E.N into Zane's mouth. For that matter, Zayn herself was like putty at this moment. Her eyes betrayed her euphoria as she felt that delicious liquid spurt into her mouth. For her, it was like drinking ambrosia, a heavenly liquid that nourished her very soul. Eventually, Draco came down from his orgasm, but his D.I.C.K was still rock hard. Zayn managed to barely pull herself from cloud 9, slowly sucking off the remainder of Draco's SEM.E.N into her throat and cleaning his rod. After that, she stood up and slowly removed the straps of her outfit, letting the whole garment fall to the floor beneath her. Stepping out of it, her fully N.A.K.E.D body was on display. A flat stomach, with slightly toned ABS, wide H.I.P.S that funneled out into a fat ass, thick thighs that one would love to be crushed in between of. Her whole body screamed of a high sex.u.a.l appeal, without even factoring in the natural effect of succubi. She relished Draco's sharp look on her body. Instead of primal L.U.S.T, there was a look of respect and possession in his eyes. Her bloodline instincts were firing all sorts of signals, but majority of them were that this new master of hers was exactly what she wanted in life. Zayn began to dance lewdly for Draco, her body twisting and turning in ways that displayed every nook and cranny of her body. Nothing was hidden from his sight in her sensual movements, making Draco's breathing become a little more rough than it already was. Her V.A.G.I.N. was clean-shaved and her vulva was slightly thick, but closed up. She had a camel toe, but her V.A.G.I.N. looked like a flower bud, instead of a wide-open lotus. Eva had a similar vulva, which Draco felt was exactly to his preference. Some preferred meteor-looking V.A.G.I.N.as, but Draco wasn't one of those people. She turned around and bent over, displaying her precious place to Draco. He could see the glistening liquid that was leaking out of it. This succubus was wet enough to allow even the C.O.C.K of a giant to penetrate her easily, much less Draco. She slowly and tantalizing twirled her H.I.P.S as she brought them down over Draco's lap. As she lowered the entrance of her canal right over the tip of his C.O.C.K, she began to tease it gently. Her wet and waiting P.U.S.S.Y looked like a hungry mouth that wanted to swallow a thick D.I.C.K at any cost. Zayn realized that her patience was thinning out quickly. She had wanted to tease Draco a bit, but her body couldn't resist it any longer. She wanted to be penetrated. When she realized that, she lowered herself on Draco slowly, allowing his long and thick C.O.C.K to part her folds slowly. While she was penetrated like this, Zayn screamed out in pleasure and pain, her L.U.S.T finally tasting what it desired most in this world. Draco was languidly enjoying the feeling of penetrating Zayn until he felt a thin barrier being snapped by his C.O.C.K halfway through. His expression changed when he felt that. What else could it be but AH.Y.M.E.N that had been snapped apart? Draco refused to believe that a succubus had matured to this age while retaining her V.I.R.G.I.90. This wasn't some romance story where he was her destined man, so by some miracle, she never indulged herself in her natural hormonal cravings. However, there was no mistaking it. What he tore was her HYMEN. He had felt this with Eva and few other women he had played with in his past life. Zayn seemed to be unbothered by the pain, instead raising and lowering her H.I.P.S slowly. Her extremely round, perky and thick ass vibrated like waves on the seas every time her skin met Draco's skin. It was a beautiful sight that set Draco's L.U.S.T aflame. After all, he was an ass man and this particular peach was why he was largely attracted to Zayn in the first place. His D.I.C.K felt like it was being squeezed by Zayn's V.A.G.I.N. as the soft and mushy walls enveloped and massaged the whole length of his D.I.C.K. Because of their position, his whole D.I.C.K was able to enter her, and it pushed the limits of her V.A.G.I.N. with every thrust. It was warm and wet inside her, and Draco felt like his D.I.C.K was being caressed by all the angels of heaven themselves. His D.I.C.K was sending intense sensations to his brain, some of which made him grit his teeth in order to suppress his M.O.A.Ns. Zane slowly began to pick up the pace as she got used to the huge rod inside her. Unlike Draco, her voice was unbridled as she let herself suck U.MB to her primal desires. When Draco's D.I.C.K hit her cervix each time, she would scream with ecstasy, which also affected Draco. Zane's tongue lolled out from her mouth and her eyes became cloudy with L.U.S.T and pleasure. She looked like a possessed person as she rode him so vigorously while M.O.A.ing and drooling. Her back arched and her thick legs moved powerfully, allowing her to send Draco's D.I.C.K into her deepest reaches, making her want to throw her head around with pleasure. She could barely prevent herself from reaching climax as it were, because her job was to service, not be serviced. However, there was very little she could do when a long and fat D.I.C.K was pushing apart the walls of her P.U.S.S.Y and rubbing inside her with such power. Their genitals were soppy with her juices, as her natural lubrication flowed out unceasingly. Pa! 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 That was the sound of their flesh slapping together as Zane rode Draco in a reverse cowgirl position. Her arms gripped the armrests of the sofa for dear life. Her H.I.P.S had long developed a mind of their own, refusing to obey her commands to slow down. For that matter, Draco himself was on the verge of bursting again. His D.I.C.K was slick with her fluids that made penetrating her so easy and so intense that his legs were trembling. The familiar hot fluid began traveling his urethra, with an even more intense and heavy feeling this time. He knew he was about to release his seed into Zane, but it was all he could do to remain sane at this point. Draco realized he had bitten off more than he could chew this time. The V.A.G.I.N. of a succubus was too godly. It molded itself into the shape of his D.I.C.K, taking the optimal form that could cause him the most pleasure. Such a perfect canal was a taboo and should not be used on any man. Draco could have held on longer had he shut his eyes and focused harder, but his mistake was looking down and seeing Zane's beautifully fat ass swallowing his D.I.C.K as he heard her loud M.O.A.Ns of ecstasy. She had bent over, displaying everything to Draco, including exactly how powerfully his impressive D.I.C.K was penetrating her. This was the breaking point for him. With a low and deep M.O.A.N he could no longer keep back, he burst his SEM.E.N into her with unparalleled vigor. It was almost as if his D.I.C.K wanted to penetrate her with his C.U.M as well. Zane grabbed Draco's testicles as he came, massaging them in order to release more. She bounced up and down very slightly on Draco's lap with each powerful shot of C.U.M sent into her canal, her expression euphoric as she screamed out her joy. She tightened her V.A.G.I.N. around his D.I.C.K, like a snake swallowing its prey, in order to push out more C.U.M from Draco. It took him a full minute of non-stop C.U.M shots to release all he had into her. While this was unrealistic in terms of real-world biology, Boundless easily allowed for such acts if the users wanted it to be so. When Draco was done, Zane didn't even manage get off him properly. She slowly fell to the floor with her ass facing upwards, displaying the thick fluid leaking out of her vagina. Her face was locked in a mask of dazed elation, her tongue lolling out and her eyes cloudy. If it wasn't for her occasional twitching, Draco would think she was unconscious. He himself panted a little, coming down from the sheer intensity of sex with the succubus after a few minutes. He eventually climbed out of his sofa and waddled over to the super mini small world bathroom to clean up. Once he landed in the hot springs, he covered his face with a towel as he relaxed into the warm waters. With a difficult expression, Zane also came down from her euphoria and dragged herself to her feet. She barely managed to put on her attire and stagger back to her room, where she fell to her knees. Before her, a face suddenly emerged from the currents of worldly energy present in the area. It was a familiar face, the same one that had appeared after Draco had killed Ratchet. It was Mephisto, the Devil King. "Well, how was it?" he asked her with an intense gaze. "It was excellent, my lord. I've never felt such a powerful feeling in my life. Nothing could prepare me for Zane began as her eyes lit up, but was stopped short. "I don't care about your feeling of losing your true V.I.R.G.I.90. I meant, did you succeed in acquiring his seed?" Mephisto asked impatiently. At that, Zane's eyes dimmed a bit. "Yes, but there's only raw energy in it. No genetic code for procreation whatsoever." "Sigh, I expected as much. They are still fresh out of the world of the gods after all. Keeping trying a few more times and let me know of the good news," Mephisto ordered before fading away. Zane remained in a kneeling position, while replying, "As you command, father." In the hot springs, Draco lifted his towel up a bit. His expression was one of interest and mocking. "A bunch of clowns," he said, returning to his lax posture as if all he saw with the eyes of Cielo was a joke to him. Chapter 44, Dorian Purple. A carriage bobbed along on the slightly paved road that led to Farce City. Within that carriage sat a man in blue-colored medium armor, his blood-red eyes gleaming with a weird pulsation. It was bizarrely fascinating to look at from up close, but anyone who did would feel the weight of 1,000,000 tons on their spirit. His black hair was curly and messy, following no particular order on his scalp. His skin was surprisingly smooth and his lips were thin. His face was angular, tapering into a sharp point. All of this combined to define a very handsome individual who would get the blood pumping of anyone who was oriented towards him. This was Draco, naturally. Draco was on his way to report to the Duke of Farst in order to begin the Flora and Fauna quest officially. When he had chosen to start the unique quest, a few limitations had been placed on him by the AI. Note, certain impositions have been placed on the execution of this quest. 1. All reputation, social relevance, and title intimidation would be negated. Player would be regarded as a mercenary by default. 2. Large-scale active spells are unavailable. 3. The Omega and subservience effects of the Divine Eyes of Cielo are unavailable. 4. True sight is limited to seeing. Rewards, 200 reputation with Sturgehaven Kingdom, 2000 reputation with the human race, 100,000 platinum, 2x legendary treasure chest. As it could be seen, Draco had been nerfed heavily. However, the AI couldn't make such decisions without a proper balance. After all, large-scale spells, the Eyes of Cielo and his reputation were things he had earned fairly. They couldn't be considered as outside help. The AI could impose limitations on players, as was set in its code, but there had to be an equivalent reward for it. If it hadn't made these limitations, Draco would have taken an hour to complete the quest, which would be meaningless to the AI. After all, it had to dedicate a huge amount of processing resources for every special unique quest. Unique quests were a sort of independent scenario that occurred for a brief period and wasn't accessible by players or NPCs that weren't part of the event. It was sort of like an instance dungeon, but with a much bigger field of play. These quests boasted unique rewards and absurd difficulty that wasn't listed in the description. Draco couldn't leave the boundary of the unique quest until he was done, so he had to power on in spite of the unfairness. Well, it wasn't technically unfair, as the provided rewards had jumped from some measly reputation, gold, and 1 epic treasure chest to what was there currently. Honestly, the money and the legendary treasure chests were good, but it would never beat the 2000 reputation with the human race. 2000 reputation with the human race meant that Draco was eligible to become an emperor. He could build a minimum of 5 kingdoms and combine them to become an empire. Even the king of Sturgehaven Kingdom would have to treat him like his grandfather. Draco pulled out 4 books from his bag. He gazed at them calmly, crossing his legs as the carriage bumped along the road. Instant healing, Active skill. Effect, heal 30% or 15,000 HP, whichever is greater, instantly. Cooldown, 2 minutes. Rain of arrows, active skill. Effect, fire a flurry of arrows non-stop with no penalties to stamina in exchange for accuracy. Cooldown, 1 minutes. Cooking, basic trade skill. Effect, learn how to prepare basic recipes for consumption. Food tastes 10% better than its optimal sensation and may provide boosts to stats. Taming, advanced trade skill. Effect, learn how to tame and domesticate various beasts. Also grants the knowledge on how to take care of tamed beasts. Draco wasted no time in learning them all. Instant healing was something he had L.U.S.Ted for in his past life. Since he didn't have the optimal trait then, his only option for self-healing was either a third-party, potions, or the passives of the Avenger class. It was a fact in most mercs that every class, even the assassin class, had a self-heal skill. However, the usefulness of each skill varied greatly. Classes like the paladin, cleric, necromancer etc. had extremely potent self-healing skills. Classes like the swordsman, assassin, and lancer had very weak self-heal skills. The Avenger class version was a passive that was like Guinevere's necklace, only boosting HP regen by a healthy percentage. This was useful when trying to recover from battle, but not much during battle itself. The instant healing skill was the self-heal ability of the Holy Mancer class, a variation of the cleric class that had no attacking capabilities whatsoever, just healing, healing, healing. Every Divine Tier guild had to have one core member that was a Holy Mancer in order to survive at the top. This was how Draco even knew the skill existed. Rain of Arrows was a skill he picked up because he wanted to train his archery. Draco was undoubtedly a combat genius, but he wasn't a jack of all trades. He had walked the path of the sword to the very end in his past life. While he could now utilize anything to fight, he never actively trained with other weapons. However, the Phoenix Cry arrow was too powerful an item to be ignored. If Draco could match his shooting skill to the level of a professional, he would be unstoppable in ranged combat. Rain of Arrows was a high-tier archery skill that required no mastery, just a bow and deep vault of arrows. Speaking of a bow, Draco had agonized over looking for a bow to match the potency of the Phoenix Cry arrow, but couldn't find anything to fit that criteria. Legendary bows weren't available and epic bows were too rare. They would also be able to bring out only 30% of the arrow's true power, which was a waste. As such, he had to put aside Phoenix Cry and use a rare bow as well as rare arrows, which he didn't have to pay for at any rank 1 or rank 2 shop. He had practically filled 55% of his maximum expanded inventory with rare arrows, draining all the stocks from shops throughout Sturgehaven Kingdom. Any shop he entered had thrown the arrows at his feet while kowtowing to expedite his passing, hoping he didn't want anything else. Draco had found the whole thing amusing. Cooking was a trade skill that was largely ignored during the first update of Boundless, but would become extremely popular after Update 1. Update 1 introduced the first changes to Boundless playstyle, including the removal unlimited stamina out of battle, the need for sleep in-game, the need for consumption of food, introduction of excrement activities and technique boosting. Draco only picked it up now because he wanted to be able to eat well during the quest. He certainly didn't need to do so, but what was a journey like without good food? Especially since he was a mercenary, it meant he would have to sleep under the stars. He hadn't taken this trade skill in his past life for obvious reasons, so he couldn't magic anything above common rank at the moment. The taming trade skill was an advanced craft, known to belong to the best beast tamers around. How was one to get a mount in Boundless? Only by either being a tamer and struggling it out, or finding a tamer who had what you wanted and pay an absurd price. Occasionally, one could get them in drops, but those mounts would either be absolute shite or above epic, both of which required a certain amount of luck. Of course, Draco knew where to get some good mounts, but he wasn't in a rush. The blink skill already satisfied a large majority of his needs as it were, and he had to build a firm foundation as quickly as possible. That was why he had put off crafting a unique set for Eva, as well as trying his hands at a bow. After learning all the skills, Draco took out the drake's egg and analyzed it. With his nerfed divine eyes, he could only see the embryo inside that was balanced within the protein. Draco's taming skill kicked in and he instinctively knew that he had to provide the egg with a high level of heat. Since he had the skill, the screen for the drake's egg changed. Description: this egg contains the offspring of a low-rank fire dragon and a rank 7 sea serpent. Skill: time left till hatching, 108 days. Egg viability, 91%. The egg was doing incredibly well. After all, the fire of war burned perpetually within Draco, making his body the optimal level of warmth one could find. The egg shivered a bit when Draco lit the magic flame under it, as if a little worm wriggling with excitement. "We done reached Lord." The peasant carriage driver, who looked around Draco's age, knocked on the top of the carriage to alert Draco. He probably assumed that Draco was asleep due to his total lack of activity the whole time. Draco put away the egg and got down from the carriage. He paid out the fare of 20 silver, which was expensive in the eyes of a normal NPC or player, and activated appearance deception, 9 forms. Instead of wasting his limited slots, after all, each form was permanent after being designed, he decided to use the tried and true form of Drake. The handsome rogue was born again, free to roam the world and trample on the hearts of innocent maidens. Before him stood the gates to a mansion that was quite literally no less than rank 4. It was almost the size of a castle, just barely falling short of one. The mansion was walled very simply, no real fortifications present. However, just like how Draco could see the mansion's level, he could tell that there was a myriad of building enchantments that were either defense, attack, or traps. Anyone below rank 4 who tried to intrude here should be ready to meet their comrades in the other world. 2 guards in a purple livery, which were the colors of the Duke of Farst, came up to Draco with their spears in a relaxed position. "Ho there, fellow. What brings you to the mansion of Lord Duke?" the older one of the duo asked. "I'm here to investigate the recent happenings in the 4-Point Valley. His Excellency is expecting me," Draco answered with a friendly smile. His demeanor made the guards like him, as they became much more amiable instantly. Draco made some small talk with them as he entered the mansion and gazed upon its magnificent decoration. It had almost the same layout as the manor in the Vita settlement, but with almost 4 times the scale and a few other functional rooms. Draco was led into the private parlor and asked to wait. A few servants brought in some beverages and scones for him to enjoy while he waited for the Duke of Farst to meet him. Draco sorted out what he pilfered from the minds of the guards. It seemed as if the issues were of a bizarre and parasitic nature. A few flowers that had been harmless pickings for some of the female maids had become monstrous entities that almost killed them if they hadn't been quite skilled themselves. More than a few animals like rabbits, squirrels, and even mice had gone from gentle and timid creatures to rabid animals that would rip and tear anything that had blood flowing through its veins. It was bizarre to the guards, who had no idea what the cause was. Most figured the 4-Point Valley had been cursed. Draco would have agreed with them, but he suspected that it was possibly a new breed of parasite that caused all this. It was either a plant-like being or a creature with warm/cold blood. He also gleaned the situation within the 4-Point Valley itself. Within the 4-Point Valley were 4 groups of people that lived together in forced harmony. Each of them occupied a corner, leaving them in each 90-degree section of the valley while remaining almost equidistant from each other. The beings to the top right, situated in the rocky section of the 4-Point Valley, were the green orcs, who were larger than common orcs. They were the most hated group in the valley as they frequently raided the other 3, capturing food, women and wealth. The only reason they hadn't been ganged up on was because the Duke of Farst promoted their actions, stating that it was survival of the fittest. The group at the top left, within the savannah, were the wood elves, a fair race of men and women who lived off the land. They were physically attractive but extremely hardy, unlike high elves, favoring the art of hunting and sports. These wood elves weren't the type to shy away from meat or killing animals, as long as it was for nourishment only. The group in the bottom left, smack dab in the middle of the forest, were the Dryads. They were the ones with the closest relationship to the wood elves, being entities that were born from trees and were bonded with them for life. Dryads were neutral towards everyone, even the green orcs. The green orcs also dared not attack the Dryads unnecessarily, as those forests belonged to them in every way possible. Each skirmish they'd launched towards them ended similar to Hitler's assault of Russia. The final group, who lived in the plains to the bottom right, were the gypsies. This group of dark-skinned humans were similar to the indigenes of the Paradise Lands, but much more attractive and intelligent. Do not dare challenge a gypsy in philosophy unless you were Socrates reincarnated. They mostly focused on dancing and music, being the most potent with illusion arts. Many of their men and women had been captured by the green orcs, making their enmity as high as the sky. The political situation of the 4-Point Valley was equivalent to a kettle that was reaching the boiling point. It would soon overflow and blow steam. With this new bizarre occurrence going on, an indiscriminate slaughter would have occurred had the Duke of Farst not suppressed everything. Draco sighed after putting together all he knew. He hadn't even started the quest truly and he began feeling the onset of a headache. Dealing with those incompetent fools alone would require precious time he didn't have. Especially those Dryads. The easiest to deal with would be the green orcs. Wood elves and gypsies had the same difficulty in his eyes. Soon enough, a tall middle-aged man in spectacles entered the room with a casual smile. His eyes were the shape of crescents, seeming to be perpetually closed. His smile was so wide that it looked a bit bizarre. His hair was greenish-blue and his skin tone was a pallid color. He wore a simple overcoat with golden black buttons and a reddish-brown color. His house logo was embroidered onto the side of his coat, denoting his origins and status. Underneath, he wore a simple purple shirt that was buttoned up to his neck. The buttons on this one was plain white, thankfully. His fitting pants looked like it was made of cotton, bearing a pitch black color. His loafers were also black, giving his attire's color scheme a bizarre combination. "I hope I didn't make you wait too long, Mr. Drake." "No last name." Draco replied with an outward smile, but inwardly, he was frowning. "Aha, right. To make things more casual, you can call me by my first name, Dorian," he replied, plopping down casually onto a seat opposite Draco. Dorian's eyes roamed about the room idly, before landing on Draco. "What would you like to know about the situation you're here to investigate?" Getting straight to it, That sounded just like Dorian Purple, Duke of Farst and the most hated Duke in the history of Boundless. Yep, as you might imagine, Draco knew Dorian very well. Not from this life, but his past one. While Dorian might be treated well now, his name would be later smeared in the history books forever. This Duke was a spy from the demons. At a critical moment, he had betrayed the human race and allowed the demon race to infiltrate the defensive lines of the battleground through a waypoint in this very manner. That was why Draco and Eva had gone through extreme hell during the Great War in their timeline, having to defend over and over, dying so many times that the experience gained from killing demons balanced out the experience lost from death. It was natural that he didn't like being around such a fellow. With his Omega blocked and the Duke of Farst's existence required to claim the rewards, he couldn't end the fellow right away. However, he planned to do so the minute the quest was completed. "Please tell me everything you know, my lord," Draco asked humbly. Dorian began to explain everything Draco knew, but with much more detail. Draco made sure to act and react as if an ignorant person would, sharing his preliminary insights and suspicions with Dorian. Dorian himself seemed impressed with Draco's knowledge and skill. He probably expected a dunce who could only swing a weapon to show up. "Thank you for all you've shared so far, my lord. I'll be taking my leave in order to begin work immediately. Draco stood up and began to leave the room. Dorian also stood up and replied to Draco with a smile. Take care, Drake. The 4-Point Valley is a dangerous place. Draco nodded and left the room stately, the eyes of Dorian never leaving his back throughout. For a brief instant, the perpetually closed eyes of Dorian opened slightly as he hummed with interest. Chapter 45, Interlude, Birth of the Ultimate Life Form. At the exact same moment Draco began his unique quest, a world-shaking occurrence took place within the central area of the 4-Point Valley. If the northeast was rocky, the northwest was a savanna, the southeast were plains and the southwest was the forest, then the central area was comprised mostly of water bodies, green grass, and a few small woodlands here and there. Within one of these water bodies, a small seed rose to the surface and attached itself to the bank. This seed was larger than most others, almost the size of the fist of an adu.l.t human. The seed reached land and retained its grip on the earth, almost as if for dear life. The way it trembled, one could get the uncanny feeling that if it had lungs, it would be gasping and coughing by now. The seed didn't look like a seed on closer inspection, but rather more like the shell of a nut. This fact became more logical when the seam that divided the seed into two split open, allowing the shape of a tiny entity out. The organism looked no different from a smaller version of a humanoid with strange oval-like green gems on its shoulders, elbows, knees and forehead. Its eyes were essentially two bright green irises, instead of a cornea and pupils. Its skin was a pale blue color and seemed elastic. It had no genitalia for that matter. Author's note, look up Echoes, Act 3. It looks a lot like that stand. When it came out of the seed, it fell into a kneeling position, its body trembling with effort as it struggled to rise to its feet. When it finally managed to achieve that feat, it spent an even longer time stabilizing itself. A squirrel that was level 1 with only 10 HP came skittering by, not even bothering to avoid the strange organism near it. Even a mammal that was classified as prey, with the strongest instincts of caution and wariness, deemed it to be harmless in every essence. When the organism saw the squirrel, its emotionless eyes gleamed as it wobbled over towards it. The squirrel, seeming oblivious to the approach of the organism, remained still while searching for its next meal. The acorns and nuts within the woodland were reducing in quantity, leaving it with an increasing difficulty in finding food for sustenance. The organism took weak and unsteady steps towards the squirrel at first, but if any sentient being were around, they would be terrified at how quickly this newborn adapted to the world around it. Each step became steadier and more fluid, like fast-forwarding the learning years of a toddler into a child. The squirrel eventually noticed the seed that the organism was born from, thinking it to be a nut. Excited, it rushed up to the seed and began nibbling at it as if it had no care in the world. The organism, which had now mastered the art of walking, calmly walked up to the squirrel. When it stood behind it, it paused for a few seconds before doing the unthinkable. It opened its small mouth, which was toothless, and somehow managed to bite out a chunk of the squirrel's flesh. Squealing in pain and terror, the poor rodent fell on its back and tried to unsuccessfully flee away before dealing with its assailant. The organism swallowed the flesh of the squirrel. What was even more harrowing was that it instantly grew 10% larger the moment the flesh hit its belly, assuming it had won. Still though, it was but a pipsqueak to the squirrel and the rodent treated it as such. It screeched and leapt at the organism with anger. Any sentient being would hesitate to go near this organism as it raised a ton of biological red flags, but the squirrel wasn't that clever. However, what was shocking was that the organism didn't display any inhuman skill or powers. It was pushed down by the squirrel and had one of its arms ripped off. It didn't display any form of discomfort or pain, instead it replied to the assault by ripping out another chunk of the squirrel and swallowing it whole. The moment it did, its destroyed arm regenerated and it grew 5% bigger. The rodent squealed in pain, but couldn't recognize the exact danger of this organism's ability. It continued to bite with its buck teeth, ripping out a large portion of the organism's torso, even as another piece of it was consumed, triggering the regeneration and growth of the organism. The horrifying and bizarre battle continued until the squirrel felt the call of death upon it. Even if it was an animal, it recognized that it had kicked a steel plate this time and wanted to flee. However, the organism had consumed enough of it to attain the same size as the rodent. Just as it wanted to flee, its half-eaten neck was grabbed firmly by the organism. It was now its turn to be pushed down and consumed bite by bite, as its scream slowed weakened until it died. Its flesh was absorbed by the organism until only bones were left. By that point, the organism had grown into a human toddler's size and its bizarre makeup looked a lot more intriguing rather than worrying. Any one player who saw it would think it looked cool as hell. It cricked its neck ominously, looking around the bank of the pond to see that it was a lake that resided in a clearing within a forest. That was why the squirrel had been present here. It was looking for dropped acorns as well as coming to drink water. It also wasn't the only one that used this watering hole. The very next instant, a cute-looking bunny hopped towards the clear pond, bending its head to drink the water contained within. It also acted obliviously to the organism, its danger level not registering on its timid instincts whatsoever. Just like before, the organism walked up to the bunny. Instead of biting into it, it gripped the mammal by its neck and held it on while it struggled. It was clear that the organism had learned that other beings would respond negatively when being consumed. In order to prevent its growth from being stunted, it wanted to minimize the damage it had to heal. Its ability to reason and think was growing per bite. It ripped into the poor squealing bunny and reduced it to bones as well. When it was done, its body mass grew, but not as much as before. Clearly, in order to grow greatly, it either needed to consume something significantly bigger than it or eat a lot of things like the bunny. As if the gods themselves wished to see the success of this dangerous being, a level 2 boar with 50 HP casually strutted into the area, ignoring the organism, just like the ones before it. Just like that, a terrifying characteristic of the organism was revealed. It seemed as if any living thing that looked upon it would disregard its existence, treating it like a mere ant. Even animals that were berserk in nature like the boar would disdain attacking it. What was it that every predator desired in this world? Was it not the ability to approach prey without being detected? If so, then this organism clearly was a king of predators, an ultimate life form of sorts. It slowly walked up to the boar this time, but it halted when it got close. It wasn't due to any reaction from the boar but, something was tingling in its mind. Its developing brain was morphing, become fuller and more intricate with every growth support it achieved so far. Due to its already humanoid-like appearance, one could assume its brain to be similar to a human's as well. Since it had achieved the size of a toddler, its thinking capacity naturally increased from purely instinctual to some form of sentience. That tingling in its head was simply the formation of its first thoughts, which it had no idea of what it signified. Dangerous. Finally, the tingling morphed into a coherent thought that conveyed the meaning of the word, but not in the human language of course. Its raised leg fell down as it watched the boar drink water casually and without fear. It looked around the clearing once again, trying to ascertain how to consume this perfect source of flesh for its growth. As it looked towards one of the trees nearby, it saw a snake bite into a large rat. The rat began fighting and clawing to escape, but the snake held on. Eventually, the rat's body stopped moving and became limp, allowing the snake to swallow it down. The organism stared at the snake emotionlessly before walking towards it and climbing up the tree. It fell down multiple times in the attempt, but after each try, its body adapted and it climbed a little higher than the last time. Eventually, it managed to reach the branch in which the snake was resting as it digested its prey. Like the bunny before it, it grabbed the animal's neck tightly before consuming it to the bone. Its mass didn't grow at all, which would render any bystander flabbergasted. No matter what, it should gain something, right? This wasn't some tiny snake, but one that could swallow a large rat. The organism jumped down to the ground and gazed at the boar, which had plopped itself down on the bank of the lake, totally unconcerned with anything, even the horrific consumption that occurred behind it. The organism walked up to the lazy boar and opened its mouth. Instead of the stubs, two sharp fangs protruded out of its mouth, dripping with a ghastly green liquid. Without hesitation, it bit into the neck of the boar and climbed into its back, holding on for dear life. The boar, after being bitten, began to screech and cry in pain, attempting to get the assailant on its back off by any means necessary. It jumped and run about, banging itself on tress to no avail. The organism clung onto it without letting go, continuously pumping lethal venom into the body of the boar. After a period of struggling, the boar also died with grievance, not understanding how it could have ignored such a lethal threat all this while. The organism wasted no time on chomping down and gorging on all the flesh of the boar. By the time it was done, it had reached the size of a 13-year-old human, and its body became smoother, more tensile, and more resilient. Its arms became a little more buff and its legs became slightly thicker. Its face became less gender-neutral, looking more and more like a male. It clenched its own hands repeatedly, feeling the increase of strength that came with its growth. However, a much more important increase occurred in its cranium, as its mind became much more astute. What am I? As would be the first question of any life form that achieved sentience without the guidance of any other of its kind, as well as bloodline memory, it questioned its own existence. Who am I? Do I have an identity? What was I born to do? It pondered over its own questions as it continued to feel up its own body. As the thoughts keep repeating in its head, it realized that answers seemed to be sprouting from somewhere. Where from, it had no idea. But any man dying to know the answer to his questions would not chase after the source, only relish in the answer. I am an ultima sunt of the humanoid genus. My identity is vague. I have a name though. King. My name is King. My purpose. As it pondered this answer, its eyes became sharper and sharper, going from emotionless to passionate, then to a cold arrogance. My purpose is to rule over all. Chapter 46, Green Orc Settlement. Draco left the estate of the Duke of Forest, opting to blink towards the location of the 4-Point Valley. He wanted to think about his next moves carefully. It wasn't that he was wary of anything really, but the fact that he wanted to milk this unique quests of the non-completion rewards. The thing with unique quests was that they were completely self-contained. In other words, once Draco completed the quest, any consequences and presences would cease to exist. For example, why would Draco, who had ruled over Sturgehaven Kingdom in his past life, not know about the races living within the 4-Point Valley? The answer was simple. 4-Point Valley was normally a level 25-40 field zone within the territory of Forest City. It was populated by monsters that were feral and mindless, not races stuck in a political quagmire. So he had only one chance to earn rewards. The next question would be, what could Draco earn from this endeavor? He could acquire skills, special items, and heirlooms depending on his execution. He could also earn special race change privileges from any of the 4 races within the 4-Point Valley, assuming he accrued enough reputation with them. Draco spawned in a craggy outcropping, looking much like the baboon from that old children's movie that held up a baby lion. He surveyed the area around him to find that it was a mixture of barren and dry earth as well as different size outcroppings. There were a few hills and mountains spread around too, making him feel barbaric. He dropped from the top of the rocky mound and began walking in a straight line. His eyes had already pierced through space to find the area in which the green orcs resided. For that matter, the AI had been clever to nerf Draco's divine eyes. The difference between seeing through and seeing beyond was divided into specificity and state of being. For example, take seeing. Draco could see into the minds of guards and the fellows at the auction. Yet, he had dared not peek into the mind of Dorian Purple. The reason was state of being. One couldn't compare a being like Dorian Purple to those fellows, even though the fellows at the auction had been rank 5 and 6. After all, with the Dragorugio set on, Draco was essentially a high-ranked dragon. His state of being was higher than a large majority of people, and for Dorian Purple to be above that should show how deeply he had hidden. The divine eyes of Cielo were overpowered and heavenly, but the person it was attached to was still too weak. Draco was only rank 1, and to top it off, the eyes were occupied with breaking his bloodline seal. If it weren't for the resonance, Draco might only be left with seeing on a normal basis. The state of being criteria only affected living things, however. How was seeing through and seeing beyond separated in the case of non-living and abstract subjects like space, time, and nature? It was specificity. The vaguer it was, the harder it was to use true sight on. The more specific, the easier. For example, if Draco wanted to see the Vita settlement right now, it would be too easy. That was because he had been there, so his criteria for seeing through space was easily achievable, reducing the piercing through to seeing only. If Draco wanted to see into the depths of the sea, for example, it would have to be seeing beyond, because the depths of the sea was too vague. Which sea is it? The Cario Continent Sea? The Various Peninsula Sea? If Draco specified the sea in question, it would drop to seeing through in terms of difficulty. If Draco further broke down to say that he was looking for the mermaid settlement in the Various Peninsula Sea, it would drop to seeing. For living things, it was state of being. For non-living, it was specificity. Author's note: I had a nightmare that some readers will comment on the inconsistency of the use of the divine eyes later, so I explained its rules here. Please remember this. If someone comments something that fails to take this into note later on, this daddy will bang my head on a wall. Draco was able to see the settlement of the green orcs because he was piercing through space with the exact idea of what he was looking for. As such, his casual walk there was determined in terms of gait. Still, the reason why he hadn't blinked there straight away was because he had an escort available for him. A group of male green orcs rushed at him with a myriad of weapons in their arms, ranging from axes to great swords. Author's note: for the purpose of this arc, all orcs will bear a slightly similar manner to the orcs from Warcraft 3 in terms of classes and general behavior as well as fighting style. Draco smirked as they rushed at him, taking out Excalibur. The first green orc that attacked had a single-edged scimitar in his hands. He swung the weapon down at Draco with one hand. Draco met its attack with an uppercut swing of his sword, parrying the power-packed move with ease. The orc behind the sweep was shocked that this scrawny thing before him could actually trade directly blows with him. Truthfully, Draco's base attack wasn't enough to do this. He also wasn't using Body of Godliness to direct the force of his attacks perfectly. So how on earth did this fellow attain power almost 10 times his natural strength? Because he literally did have 10 times his strength at all times. Passive 1, Sacred Force. Trace amounts of Sacred Force leaks out of you, acting as a deterrent to monsters, NPCs, and players at your level and below. Note 1, this passive is currently inactive, as all the Dragon Soul's Sacred Force was spent in the Soul Merger. Passive 2, Dragon Legacy. Possessing a small part of the soul of a divine dragon, everything about you is magnified permanently by a factor of 10. His first passive had been disabled, but the second one and the active skill were still available. Draco's idle hand blasted forward and punched the large orc right in the gut. The fellow fell back a few steps, gasping for air like he was on the verge of death. Spittle dripped from his mouth and the contents of his stomach were forcibly ejected by Draco's punch. Naturally, not a single drop of that muck touched Draco. He had already moved on to his next target, a stocky orc that swung a great axe as if it were a stick. Draco hadn't used any of his skills and techniques from his past life in any battle so far because he had never seen the need to. He didn't really need to here either, but he felt like playing around a bit. He gripped his longsword in a bizarre way, as if it were a rapier. He then thrust it forward, aiming to block the great axe in such a manner. The orc before him smirked as it ridiculed Draco in its tiny brain. Sword skill 34, reversal. His sword blurred as it collided with the very tip of the assailant's great axe. What stunned the attacker was that all the force from his heavy attack was completely rebounded onto him, making him stagger a few steps back with broken wrists. Draco kicked the green orc aside, breaking more than a few ribs in one hit. Draco made a step-in strike, blasting aside the next attack from another great sword-wielding orc, grabbing him by the back of the head and bringing the orc's face to meet his knees. Draco dealt with the remaining assailants just as easily as the first few, only disabling them instead of outright killing them. After all, he didn't want to become enemies with the Green Orc faction right off the bat. They might be a necessary cog in the wheel that was the Flora and Fauna quest. When all the orcs were on the floor, gasping and groaning in pain, he walked over to the first one, who had managed to recover from the brutal attack somewhat. Draco grabbed his throat and dragged him up, putting the orc's face near his. "Hello there, what's your name?" he asked kindly. The orc felt like head-butting the fellow. What was with that gentle tone, as if we were friends? "Have you seen what you did to us? Forget the physical damage, the mental damage you dealt to our pride was debilitating." I cough. "I am Ronner." Ronner managed to gasp out his name reluctantly. He wasn't really terrified of Draco, but this hunting group included many of the best able-bodied male orcs. If they were to die, perhaps it would be their turn to have their woman captured and played with. "Okay, Ronner. Please distribute this healing potion to your fellows. When everyone is up, tell them my name is Draco and I represent the Duke of Farst." When Draco mentioned his affiliation, the orcs' eyes widened. Truly, they had been idiots to attack a representative of their benefactor. Knowing that this human was with the Duke, Ronner became much more obedient. When Draco's orders had been carried out fully, each of the orcs lined up before him with expressions of curiosity and battle intent. Even though he was powerful, they still wanted to fight. This was why the green orcs had the backing of Dorian Purple. Demons had the exact same mentality, so he probably found some kinship in an unlikely place. "We are all healed. Mr. Ronner asked with unease. "Drake. No last name." "Haha, we don't have last names either," one of the great sword-wielding orcs said with a laugh. "Could it be that your pap was a fellow orc?" Another axe-wielding orc exclaimed, almost believing his own words before even expressing them. "It must be so. I can see that despite being a pink skin, he has some orcish handsomeness." Another less bulky orc stated with certainty. All the others agreed with him instantly. "Yeah, there's no chance for any species to produce anything this handsome unless they've got orc blood." Draco chuckled inwardly. Humans had nothing on orc kind when it came to belief in their racial supremacy. Still, he had better things to do than banter with a tribe of greenskins. "All right, enough playing. Ronner will be my spokesperson while I remain in the 4-Point Valley. Your first duty is to lead me to your clan for me to assess your combat readiness," Draco stated with a calm expression. The orcs looked between each other uncertainly. They were definitely a bit dim, but not entirely stupid. Why do we need to be combat ready? Are you gonna lead us on a raid for women and plunder?" Ronner asked with an interested gaze. The other orcs wore passionate looks as they contemplated this proposal. With Draco, who could defeat them all with ease, on their side, capturing all the females of the other races might just be possible. "No. You'll understand when we arrive. Now get moving." Draco's curt reply was met with shrugs all around as they began walking to the clan location. The orcs didn't hold back on Draco's account and began to banter with each other as they walked towards their home. "Brudda, did you hear what happened with Snorklia yesterday? Ain't that the most beautiful orc in the camp right now? What'd she do this time?" It said she led the females on a raid for some men and jewelry. Can you guess what she captured? She captured men and jewelry. Precisely. What an intelligent fellow you are. Oh, haha. My ma'am always did say I was bright as a firefly, haha ouch. Thwom, idiot, if that's all she got, why would I bother telling this story? You didn't have to hit me so hard. What did she get? She managed to capture a wood elf. What? That was my same reaction, brudda. She was so ecstatic that she washed him, cleaned him, and fed him all night. Don't tell me she's doing that just for. Yep, that wood elf is also a v.i.r.g.i.n, so she must want to get the best cream pie of her life. Damn, I wish I could capture a wood elf chick. They are so hard to grab. I'm tired of gypsies and dryads. Draco listened on with a stony expression, but inwardly he was slightly interested. He didn't bother to enter the minds of the orcs because all they knew was fighting, pillaging and. Do not listen to their banter and find them cute. These species of monsters were hated unanimously for their R.A.P.E heavy activates, and they definitely deserve the hatred they got. Unfortunately, it was something that was a part of their genetics, so one could say it wasn't their fault. Still though, all the captured men and women might or might not agree with you, depending on their personal fetishes. Once this conversation was diverted into sex.u.a.l preferences, Draco tuned out. His mind was currently replaying the moment he used sword skill 34. He felt that despite being able to execute the technique, it was lackl.u.s.ter compared to the old days. Obviously, that would because his rank was too low compared to the past. However, Draco felt differently. As the creator of the move, he knew its intricacies to the barest minimum. It felt like there was a dissonance between how he perceived the technique and how his body moved to execute it. It was uncomfortable to say the least, and he realized he would have to remedy it sooner or later. Soon enough, they arrived at the village of the orcs. It was crude to say the least, with teepee houses that were made from the skins of monsters. It wasn't that pleasant aroma-wise, since hygiene wasn't a big thing to orcs. Draco didn't mind the smell, but anyone else would choke and gag. Ronner moved to gather all the orcs in the village, regardless of what they were doing at the moment. Given the bizarre habits of the orcs, it wasn't surprising when some of them came in wearing almost nothing, with either rock-hard n.i.p.p.l.es and dripping crotches, or erect d.i.c.ks barely covered. It was pretty clear they were in the middle of something but had to pause. The most outrageous was an arguably beautiful female orc that looked the most humanoid of the bunch. Using the same measuring scale as before, her face would be about 6/10, while her toned and lean body would be a straight 10/10. One thing orcs always had were perfect bodies, they just usually had terrible faces. She came in barely covered, with a pearly white fluid leaking between her legs. She looked like someone who had already achieved their goal in life, and anything that happened afterward wasn't their problem. The sheer satisfaction on her face made Draco speechless. Woman, was our only goal in life really to get some elven c.o.c.k? Most of you are wondering why such a dashing and ethereal fellow is standing before you. Let me answer your question. I am here to resolve the issues plaguing the 4-Point Valley. Draco's heroic tone and bearing made him personally satisfied. However, there was no response from the gathered crowd. It was as if they were waiting for the punchline to a joke so that they could begin laughing. Draco sighed, as he knew he should have known better, but he had held on to hope. I am here on behalf of the Duke of Farst. Instantly, there was cheers and excited responses from the crowd, all of them gazing upon him as if he were the incarnation of the heavenly emperor himself. Draco felt depressed. He had hoped his male beauty could move these fellows into obeisance, but nothing of the sort happened. He had expected subjugating these unruly orcs to be easy, so that was why he had chosen them first. However, choosing them first also directly made subjugating the others slightly more difficult, in the sense that the orcs were public enemy number one in the 4-Point Valley, and being seen with them was definitely a reputation destroyer. When the crowd managed to calm down somewhat, Draco signaled to Ronner. Along the way, he had told Ronner what to say after he had introduced himself, because he couldn't be bothered to talk too much to these orcs. Mr. Drake is here to rid our home of the parasites that have been making pillaging and plundering more difficult. With him, we'd be able to capture more men and women as playthings. Draco looked at Ronner strangely, as that wasn't anything close to what he said. There was an excited response as the orcs felt that Draco's mission was the heavenly order itself. Ah, that beloved Duke of Farst, clearly, he understood our difficulties and wanted to help us. Bless you, Lord Duke. Bless you, Mr. Drake. Draco, who could read their thoughts, felt like face-palming. He had decided to peek into their minds this time because he wanted to see their genuine response to his presence. He wished he hadn't. When they calmed down a bit further, a hand was raised in the crowd. Everyone turned to gaze at a runty orc that wore glasses on his face. Most of the other orcs looked at him with a mixture of indulgence and care. Draco realized why when he peeked into the mind of this nerdy-looking orc. The fellow was their raid planner. He was the reason they were so successful all the time. Is it possible that the parasites have males and females for us to capture? He asked with a curious expression. Immediately, all eyes turned to Draco. If the Zero RCS had been paying half attention before, now every bit of their brain cells was set to focusing on Draco's next words. Theoretically speaking. Collective breaths were held as their huge hearts pounded furiously. It should be possible. At that, the crowd exploded. They rushed up and grabbed Draco, lifting him up and tossing him in the air as if he were the champion. Lord Drake! Lord Drake! Lord Drake! They chanted his name, and Draco suddenly felt that he had signed up for the wrong quest after all. Chapter 47, Wisdom of the Lady Boss 1. Riveting Knight stood in the office of the mayor of Vita Settlement, quietly waiting for a certain group to arrive. It was eerily silent in the office, and anyone who had been there would have felt extremely uncomfortable. Eventually, Riveting Knight sensed some presences outside the door, coming down the hallway. Unlike Draco, whose body was weak, she was essentially the same as she had been in their previous life. She could activate her control abilities to the max and without restraint. The double doors to the large office were pushed open, admitting 5 people. In came Uno, Boyd, Rena, Cobra, and finally Kieran. They had been chatting on their way there, but upon entering the office, the eerie atmosphere made them go silent. It was like walking down the streets with your friends, bantering all the way and suddenly realizing that it was far too quiet. That sense of danger and creeping fear enveloped the 5 generals like a blanket in the night. They all stared at the source of this eeriness, the woman in tight leathers that displayed a modest body that was definitely impressive, but not mind-boggling. However, her raised hood didn't even outline her face, making her seem like a humanoid version of the Nazgul. She remained still for more than half an hour, in which the 5 generals had dared not move for reasons they themselves didn't understand. It was similar to when a huge black widow was crawling slowly around your body, you'd stay still until it got off. In this time, their bodies had gone from pristine to sweaty. Since sweat wasn't considered excrement in Boundless, like feces, players could still release it. Eventually, Riveting Knight raised her head slowly, gazing at each of the 5 generals in turn, her eyes lingering slightly on Rena and even longer on Kieran. For that matter, Kieran felt a strange feeling when that happened. He felt like his bloodline squirmed when the woman called Riveting Knight gazed at him, which should be impossible. Only the top 3 lineage bloodlines should be able to. Kieran's mind instantly became tense as his expression turned solemn. This is not good, he thought. Riveting Knight didn't say anything to him personally, but that look had conveyed a lot to him. Since Riveting Knight had decided to keep quiet, Kieran's true identity wouldn't be unveiled just yet. I see you've finally arrived. When they heard the pleasant and sonorous voice that came out from under that hood, they were startled. The feeling she gave physically compared to the one her voice gave created a dissonance. You're the members of Umbra, the first guild of Boundless. Do you understand what such a title means? Riveting Knight's question made them look at each other with confusion. Sure, the titles sound great, but, so what? It was just a pretty cool FIVR game. What was the big deal about it? Riveting Knight could almost read their thoughts from their body language, or something close to it. She sighed internally, as she pondered why Draco hadn't bothered to drill this into their heads before. The problem was, Draco had much bigger issues on his plate than to baby these fellows. Before now, he didn't have his op acquisitions and Riveting Knight herself by his side, meaning he had a wide range of issues to cover as just one man. Riveting Knight reasoned as such and settled down. She realized she would have to finish what Draco started properly before she could even get to the reason why she summoned them there. All of you, follow me. Riveting Knight led the silent group to a random field zone nearby. This zone was called the Frost Fortress, and it was an ice-heavy region. The monsters here were between level 10 to 30, meaning it was prime leveling for early rank 1 players. She hadn't chosen this place intentionally, but was a random field zone that was reasonably nearby the Vita settlement. It was about 5 square kilometers, which was the size of a district in the modern world. As the group traversed the snow-capped area, the generals began to feel uncomfortable with the temperature. Rena had it reasonably easy as she could auto-cast her basic fire attack every now and then to keep warm, but the others had to fend for themselves. They didn't encounter any monsters on their trek, they just kept walking. Thanks to the limitless stamina out of combat, they could go on and on, without stopping, rendering them unable to find an excuse to rest. It also didn't help that the lady boss was silent the whole time, not even bothering to check up on them. She also didn't make a peep of complaint and her body didn't shiver in the slightest. How could they, as men, hold their heads up high if their lady boss was totally unfazed? After 4 hours of this torture, their HP bars were left with only 20% remaining and they were hit with the debuff. Their movement speed had been reduced by 70% and they were regenerating health and mana much more slowly. Also, they were taking 0.1 HP every minute. After an extra 2 hours, the first to fall to his knees at 1% HP was Cobra, who dressed like a male prostitute. Next was Uno, whose armor had become a great burden as it became stiff, forcing him to exert more effort to move it. Boyd was next to go, as his face reflected his unwillingness and shame. Kiran went on for a long while after, his face locked in an expression of calm determination. Surprisingly, Rena fell before he did, her fire magic abilities only allowing her to go on for a little bit longer compared to others. Kiran kept walking behind Riveting Knight, her back his only anchor as he took every step forward. He went on like that for another 2 hours, which seemed like years to him, until he finally died as well. Riveting Knight stopped when he did. Then she returned to where each of them had died and picked up the items they had dropped before returning to the entrance of the field zone. When players died in Boundless, they respawned at the entrance of wherever they were unless they had special skills to counteract that. Also, special circuit misstances, like the unique quests, modified this mechanic. At rank 0, they lost absolutely nothing but an item and 10% EXP. As they climbed the ranks, the penalties would become so steep that death in Boundless would be much more fearful than actually dying in real life. Riveting Knight met the 5 generals who stood around quietly, expressions of unhappiness on their faces for being put through such an experience. If it wasn't for the fact that their lady boss terrified them even more than Draco did, they'd have quit halfway. What did you learn? The 5 generals were silent for a bit before Uno spoke hesitantly. That we are weak. Riveting Knight didn't acknowledge his words, so they assumed he was wrong. Boyd made an attempt after that. We were ill-equipped. Once again, Riveting Knight remained silent. Cobra took the mantle here. We did not utilize the terrain to our advantage. Seeing her silence, they almost choked. They were grasping at straws just to get this over with. Rina decided to try. We did not utilize our classes to our advantage well enough. Riveting Knight turned to gaze at Rina, which was her only response so far. This gave them all the hope that they were onto the right path. However, Kiran, who had been silent as usual, opened his eyes that had been shut all this while and displayed a wry smile. He, unlike the other four, understood the fundamentals of what Riveting Knight was trying to teach. The others had the general idea, but they had sugar-coated it too much. We are trash. The other four's expressions changed, turning to look at Kiran with irritated and disdainful gazes. Who was trash here? If you were trash, why add us onto the equation? You are. All of you. Riveting Knight replied coldly. Kiran nodded, but the other four looked unsatisfied. No one liked being told they were trash, especially without knowing why. After all, they were made to walk through an ice zone without preparation and without any goal at her behest, yet they were trash because of that. Bullshit. If they had planned to come here, why wouldn't they have prepared ahead of time? Did this lady boss think she was the only one with brains or skills? Kiran looked at his fellows' expressions and shook his head. He, as a proud member of the lineages, hated being called trash even more than they did because it wasn't just a smear on his name, but on the name of his lineage and even their progenitor. However, pretending as if he wasn't would be an even graver insult. I can see you feel unsatisfied. Let me tell you why I called you trash. Riveting Knight began, looking at Uno first. You are moving towards the paladin class clearly, and the way it looks, you might just get it. However, do you even understand what a paladin is? Uno was startled by the question but answered immediately. A paladin is a holy warrior that is imbued with the energy of his deity to be their champion in battle. Exactly, for all intents and purposes, that is what being a paladin entails usually. Riveting Knight replied with a light nod. However, what if I told you there were no deities in this realm? She continued with a mocking tone. The five generals were startled, then their faces changed, especially Uno. Grudgingly, he filled in the logic. A paladin without a deity is trash. Like a battery without any charge in it. A bottle without any water. Riveting Knight nodded. She knew Uno's story and specifications. After all, he had been one of Draco's generals. This fella had given Darkrow a massive headache with his assault tank combat style. She was aware how he quite literally carried the paladin class from general mockery to respect. Riveting Knight turned to Cobra. You are like me, going for the assassin class. I see that you have the talent for the job, since you practice the profession in the real world too. But that is not enough. I can bet you that if I placed you, with all your skills in the real world, against a teenager who played FIVR games extensively, you would lose terribly. Cobra seemed sullen. This was after all, a massive insult to his skill. His body count wasn't low at all and he had refined the art of murder for years. To be told that he couldn't even beat some nerdy kid made him angry. I know you feel it's untrue and that would only hold in the real world. If I were to create that same scenario in the real world, you would kill that teen 99 times out of 100. What about that one time that Cobra loses? You can't really expect a teen to kill him, right? Boyd asked uncertainly. No, that would be impossible. That one scenario where he might lose was if Cobra was struck by lightning or had a sudden heart attack. Riveting Knight replied with a mis.e.m.e.nt in her voice. She looked to Boyd himself next, and the one-eyed fellow began to sweat. I see you're going for a berserker class. With your body structure, it would be a perfect match for you. However, you will never reach the pinnacle with this class for the same reason Cobra and Uno will fail. Riveting Knight turned to Rina and gazed at her quietly. This woman. Riveting Knight remembered her well. She, like Draco, knew Rena's damage, and as a fellow victim of forced sex.u.a.l abuse, she sympathized with her a lot. Still, Rena had betted Draco far too many times in their past timeline for Riveting Knight to let it go so easily. Rena tilted her head slightly. What was this? She felt like she was being pitted one moment, then felt slight killing intent the next. Was she hallucinating or what? You chose the path of the mage. Out of all the people here, your choice is the one that I could spend hours explaining on how much trash you will be in the future, but let me make it short. What is magic? This question caught Rena off guard. Magic is the ability to do the impossible. Riveting Knight shook her head slowly. She knew Rena's case would be the worst, so she would have to work on her the hardest. That is the answer any elementary school child can give. Magic has nothing to do with making the impossible possible. Magic is simply the ability to influence the world with willpower and energy. Riveting Knight hadn't taken a magic class in their past life, but her sister for life, Sublime Notion, had been a magic class user. She had told this to Riveting Knight so many times that it was stuck in her head. Riveting Knight then turned to Kiran. She sized him up quietly and he did same. The other four noticed there was a tense danger lingering in the air between these two, and they suddenly felt as if they were side characters in a show that had no idea what was going on behind the scenes. You already know your faults, so I don't need to explain. Riveting Knight finally acquiesced on behalf of Draco. Kiran seemed to relax at that moment, as if he had been tense to either fight or flee the moment she spoke. The other four also calmed down a little when they noticed that the dangerous feeling had dissipated. Riveting Knight gazed at them collectively, shaking her head. The fundamental issue underlining your trashiness is your mentality first and foremost. Second, would be your ignorance. Then your skills. Finally, your willpower. Let's start with your mentality. The five of you came into this world thinking that it's a game, just like everyone else. Let me be frank with you, it is not. This is, and will be, the new era for mankind. Why do I think so? Here's why. Riveting Knight scanned each of them with a tilt of her head. This world is almost not different from the real one. Your senses, actions, and thoughts are unrestrained. It feels just like reality, does it not? Yet, it isn't. It is 1,000 times better. In this world you can do anything you want and make progress. You can be a blacksmith, a physician, a fighter, a gambler. You can be a diviner, a farmer, an alchemist and more. Those are just trade skills I'm mentioning. Let's not even start with the combat classes. In this world that feels like real life, you will never die. You will live forever and never age. You can fight, f.u.c.k, steal, eat and play. As you get stronger, you can do things that are physically impossible in the real world. All the cool stuff you see in the movies are easily achievable here with enough effort. The most important aspect of this world, however, is the extension of life. If, and I say, if, a method to stay fully immersed in the game, like some sort of gaming pod or cabin, were developed, do you understand the magnitude of such a thing? The time dilation in this game grants us 4x more time than the real world does. Essentially, staying fully immersed in the game means that you'll live 4 times longer. Do you understand? How could they not? The 5 generals were trembling where they stood. Riveting Knight's words had hit them right in the place they didn't want to acknowledge. When they had been training with Draco, they had simply thought that this game was super cool and might become big in the future. However, they hadn't know exactly how big. It was like when smartphones first came. We found them nifty and an impressive step up, but no one could have predicted how staple it would become to modern life. Now that they had a firm grasp of the effect this new game, no, this new world, would have on society, they slowly began to understand exactly why the lady boss was so disdainful of them. They also began to feel the burning desire to get stronger. After all, everyone would be entering this world soon. The ensuing chaos as everyone fights for a piece of the pie would be catastrophic for weaker players. Only the upper echelon could ride the waves like a calm sea surfer and direct where they wanted events to go. The rest would rise and fall at the whims of those at the top. It was Uno who spoke up first after a bout of silence. "You were right, madam, we are trash." "I agree with him," Cobra added simply. "We were thinking far too simply, failing to assess the facts." Boyd concurred with a wry smile. "This world would become a pillar of mankind. We that are early have the privilege of steering future events, yet we failed to take the opportunity seriously." Rena lamented with a shake of her head. Kiran remained silent, just looking at the other four with a hint of disdain. Riveting Knight gazed at the silently before shaking her head. "You think you've understood something, but really, you've only understood 20% of what I'm trying to get across. The reason you are trash is compound, not so simple. The second reason I mentioned was your ignorance, and your earlier statements buttress that. In the world, in any world, knowledge is power. Even the strongest fighter can be defeated by the smartest weakling. What do you all even know about Boundless? Nothing. And you've made no effort to rectify that." Chapter 48, Wisdom of the Lady Boss 2. The five generals remained silent at that. Truly, what did they know about the game other than what Draco had taught them? And even most of that was common knowledge to gamers. These five had lived hard lives, never having the time or interest in anything that wouldn't further their goals. Hell, the only reason they even bothered to enter this game was because a young control master told them to, period. Oh, they would have definitely joined the game after it became popular, but they would have been bottom feeders at that point. Draco, when training them, had to teach them from the absolute ground up. It was similar to having to teach your grandmother how to use a computer. They had absolutely no foreknowledge on anything like RPG mechanics, typical world building, player lingo, and interaction, etc. Of course, Boundless simplified a lot of these things in anticipation of people like them. However, it was like using a computer like a typical user instead of a programmer. They would eventually fall behind the rest. In any popular game today, the best players worldwide weren't just about skill or talent. A lot of it went to the fact that they had spent hours researching the game, its mechanics, how they interacted, and especially how they could be exploited. They were always up to date on any new addition so they could factor it into their playstyle. Yet these five knew next to nothing aside from how to level up, use items, and do basic combat in their future classes. Even the classes they were heading toward were things they only found out after doing a general research on MMORPG games after Draco ordered them to create accounts. They didn't spend much time or effort researching the ones they chose, only selecting the ones they were either cool or sexy. You see? You know nothing about Boundless. You haven't put in the time or effort to learn more even with all you have been shown so far. Riveting Knight began walking towards a grassland and the five generals followed her quietly. The grassland stretched out as far as the eye could see, with the occasional tree as well as ponds here and there. There were a few thick bushes by the roadside as well. There seemed to be a man-made path here of gravel, which they walked on comfortably. There is far too much depth in the operation of this world that it took Draco and I a while to uncover the most of it. At this, the five generals looked between each other with uncertainty. Hadn't this game been out for just under a business week? Did the lady boss misspeak, or did she have some form of access to the game beforehand? Of course, with their lack of knowledge in the area of gaming, they had no idea of the existence of beta testers. Otherwise, they'd have assumed that she were one. I cannot and will not stuff all that knowledge into your head. That is your duty and responsibility as a member of Umbra. Riveting Knight spawned, throwing knives in her hand, and twirled them around her finger casually. She flicked her wrist out lightly, sending all three hurtling in different directions. A white glow shrouded the throwing knives, adding a trail of light to its flight. The party heard 3 shrill screeches come from the ground where the throwing knives had pierced. Out of the earth came 3 monsters, with spiky shells and a mammalian face that looked unsure of whether it wanted to be cute or ferocious. They stood on 2 feet with hunched backs and their bellies were soft, dark brown flesh. Name, Feral Pangolin, Specialist Rank Monster. HP, 500/900. The 5 generals became serious when they saw the monsters. Even though they were 5, they felt that they were trapped in a difficult situation. After all, specialist rank monsters required at least a 4-man party of semi-pros to handle when at the same level. Meanwhile, these 5 weren't even rank 1, so there was both a level and a rank suppression on them. These suppression effects weren't debilitating. One just needed the skill, or equipment, to counteract this mechanic. Draco and Riveting Knight were able to fight equally up to 1 rank and 20 levels maximum of suppression. Even 1 small level more and they'd be fighting a losing battle. In other words, if Draco was currently level 14, rank 1, he could fight a monster which was level 34, rank 1 at best till it became too hard. Of course, that was assuming he had basic equipment and none of his fusion items available. To fight 1 rank above him, he needed to be within 20 levels of the rank. So at rank 1, level 30, Draco could fight a rank 2, level 50 monster. Fighting skilled NPCs was much harder, so the amount of levels Draco could cross was limited. The 5 generals had none of that skill. They could team up and barely take a specialist monster down at their own level, but something like this was beyond them. Next, we'll be discussing your skills. Quite frankly, they are absolutely terrible. Riveting Knight pointed at the feral pangolins as she spoke. 2 of you will each take a pangolin. I'll join the person with no partner and assess their skills for a bit. After that, I'll swap into each team to get one-on-one time with you all as you fight. The 5 generals shared a worried look before nodding. If they wanted to get better, they would have to take risks. Besides, the lady boss was here. Also, they couldn't really lose too much when considering the stakes. Only 1 item and 10% EXP was easily reclaimable at rank 0. They split into teams then. Cobra and Kieran were in Team 1 and Boyd and Uno in Team 2. Poor Rena was left out and she definitely didn't like that. Hey, what's with this discrimination and sexism? Is this sis really so ugly that you boys will leave me alone? She complained with a pout. The 4 gave her disdainful looks and moved away. F.U.C.K. I hope you all die as V.I.R.G.I.Ns. Rena cursed angrily before storming away, towards Riveting Knight. This curse got them all riled up as they retorted with indignation and fear. Shit, woman, how could you be so mean? What kind of curse is this? Uno asked angrily. How can you place such misfortune on this daddy? What have I ever done to you? Boyd shouted with passion. Humph, your words will never come true. I have already been defiled. Cobra said while rubbing his bum. I have no interest in the carnal. Kieran answered quietly. Riveting Knight chuckled and moved beside an unhappy Rena, who looked like she wanted to sulk heavily. She took out 2 daggers that gleamed with eerie brightness. Their serrated edges made one cringe instinctively, knowing that if you were pierced by it, pulling out the weapon would be more painful than pushing it in. Since you have chosen your teams, move out and attack. Your aim is not to defeat your enemy, which you definitely cannot do. It is to survive until I get a handle on each of your skills. Riveting Knight's command was drowned out by the shrill cries of the pangolins, who had decided to attack their enemies in retaliation. Cobra began swaying in that bizarre and nausea-inducing way that he did, like a snake slithering up to its prey slowly. He also utilized daggers and throwing knives, so he tossed a few out in the more traditional way. 3 out of the 5 knives he threw hit their mark, but did less than 20 damage altogether, even though it hit the soft underbelly of the pangolin. Cobra was startled by this and almost got swiped into oblivion by the pangolin's claws. However, he was saved by Kiran, who performed a double spin kick in mid-air, hitting the face of the pangolin. The monster cried out and grabbed its bleeding snout, glaring at Kiran with monstrous killing intent. Kiran's well-timed kick had only dealt 36 damage, 18 for each spin kick. His face became solemn as he truly understood why the lady boss said that they'd be unable to kill their enemies, only make sure that they survived. They were far too weak to do any heavy or debilitating damage. They couldn't even take a single hit, or that'd be the end of them. Trying to battle the monster would be much more difficult than just dodging its attacks. Cobra seemed to reach the same conclusion himself, so he leapt back and stood beside Kiran. The two fellows shared a look and nodded. Cobra fished out more throwing knives that were of a low quality, practically trash tier, and began throwing them non-stop towards the monster's soft spots. Kiran stomped on the ground and thrust his hands forward, creating a slight shockwave that sent dust flying forward. It was a crude attempt at a smoke screen that wouldn't work in real life, but like the lady boss said, such marvels were possible in this magical world. Boyd and Uno hadn't learned as quickly as Cobra and Kiran did. They were convinced that their combo of defender and attacker would be enough to wear down the monster. Uno placed his tower shield before him and braced himself to deflect the attacks like Draco taught him. When the pangolin's claw connected with the metallic protective cover, it scraped deeply into it, almost reaching Uno who was behind it. He was so spooked that he almost screamed like a little girl. The force of the attack also rendered his arm numb, making it hard to align the shield into the way of the next swipe attack. Boyd roared and swung his large poleaxe down onto the arm of the pangolin. His common tier poleaxe only left a wild line on the skin of the pangolin. Still, it reeled back in pain and glared at Boyd because even though the cutting aspect of the attack was useless on its hide, the force from the swing itself caused tremendous pain. His power-packed swing had only dealt 25 damage to the pangolin, only serving to make it angrier. It ignored Uno and swiped at Boyd, who placed his poleaxe in front of himself like a shield. Boyd was confident in this poleaxe because it had even defended against those bears in the Ursus cave dungeon. There was no way this feral pangolin could be stronger than a bear. Boyd was right, but the problem was that these pangolins didn't need strength. Their bodies had excellent defense, so they evolved in a way that made their claws sharper than steel. This proven when the monster dug into the head of the poleaxe, drawing deep and terrifying gashes into the steel. Boyd shuddered with fear as he leapt back and avoided the follow-up swipe attack. Uno threw his tower shield with all the strength he could muster, allowing it to hit the back of the pangolin's head. The monster groaned and clutched its noggin with pain and muddiness. He rushed up behind it, roaring as he charged. Shoulder bash. Uno used a classless skill of the melee type, which was shoulder bash. It was cheap and easy to acquire with the funds they had gotten from multiple first clears, which Draco had divulged to them without thinking twice. He collided with the poor monster and sent it shuffling forward, almost toppling over on itself. Uno's strength was high, but not high enough to knock such a large and thick monster forward. There were various factors that went into it, like the pangolin's lowered focus, Uno's heavy armor's weight that bled into his momentum, Uno's momentum itself and the bonuses from the skill. Riveting Knight noticed this from the side and nodded her head secretly. This was more like the Uno she knew. She had been aggrieved by the prowess of these five in her past life, but Uno had been a downright nightmare. In terms of pure combat talent, he was second to only Kiran. Even Kiran's talent was solely due to his lineage, unlike Uno was 100% human. Riveting Knight turned to watch Rina, who was struggling with their own monster. She was auto-casting her basic attack, but the monster just roared through the pain and chased after her. It created a sight that most MMORPG players of the olden days would find familiar, where a player with ranged abilities would have to stay mobile while assaulting a melee enemy. Kiting. One of the most classic techniques of RPG games. Rina had no idea what kiting was, but circustances had forced her to adopt the technique in order to survive. Riveting Knight wasn't being much help, only making sure that the pangolin didn't get a chance to gnaw on the alluring fire mage easily. Riveting Knight watched them for a bit before switching out with Boyd, fighting a pangolin with Uno. Boyd and Rena made a terrible combo and Riveting Knight had to switch out again with Kieran in order to balance it out somewhat. They fought like this for a whole quarter of an hour before Riveting Knight threw 3 gleaming throwing knives right into the eyes of the pangolins, breaching through to the other side. Unlike Cobra, who threw with the typical throwing force of an ADU.L.T man, Riveting Knight threw with her body of godliness activated. It meant all the force in her body was concentrated in the throw, making her projectiles hurtle at scary speeds. With such an effect, even blunt items could turn into the sharpest projectiles, much less an actual sharp weapon. When the monsters fell to the floor and became motes of pixels, Rena rushed out like a wild animal and grabbed all the coins that had fallen. She didn't even care if she dirtied her robes or her body as she grabbed them shamelessly. The other 4 were panting and shaking from the intense fight, but they made doubly sure to look away from Rena, pretending not to know her. Riveting Knight watched this all with a mis.e.m.e.nt before making her point. As you can see, you 5 have no grasp of the utilizations of your skills. Your timing and usage were below trash tier, falling into the abhorrent category. Boyd looked at Riveting Knight strangely. I might not be much of an axe user in real life, but I'd say my handling of one wasn't that bad. Also Cobra and Kieran are adept in their fields of combat, so how could our skills be trash? That is because you do not understand what I'm saying. When I say skills, I do not mean techniques. Those are different and are ruled by separate mechanics. Riveting Knight answered while crossing her arms. When I say skills, I mean your active and passive combat skills. I'm referring to the skills that can only be utilized in the game. The 4 of them looked startled because they had never considered it from that angle. They had assumed she was referring to their general combat abilities, not those combat skills they had purchased and learned. What's the difference between a technique and a skill? Kieran asked the most prudent question at the moment. A technique is an application of knowledge in any field or from any field that has no assistance by the system. Riveting answered, turning to Cobra this time. For example, Cobra, our ability to throw knives is something we do on our own, without the help of the system, is it not? That is an example of a technique. She turned to Uno this time. Uno, when you used shoulder bash, that was a skill, wasn't it? You could have just run normally and performed a manual shoulder bash, but you used a skill to do it. Can you describe the difference for your mates? Uno was startled at being in the spotlight, but he nodded his head and became quiet. He pondered his words carefully before speaking. When charging at enemies myself, it feels normal in the sense that I have to control everything. My speed, my footwork, my posture, my target. However, when using the skill all of that was automated. It was handled for me and optimized to function at its best within the limits of my strength. That's how I felt. Riveting Knight nodded. That is the main difference between skills and techniques. One is activated at its optimal form within your limits while the other is manually controlled yourself. Which of the 2 are better? Rena asked after pocketing the coins quietly. Neither. Skills have their advantages and disadvantages and so do techniques. What is most important is the application and timing of both. Riveting Knight started walking again and the 5 generals followed behind. This time, instead of fear and a little bit of dissatisfaction, they followed with respect and familiarity. They had accepted their lady boss, eerie as she was, because of her insight and her skill. For example, a person might purchase a throwing knife skill while another might spend day and night training to develop the technique. The benefit the skill has over the technique is that it is instantly learned, easily usable and optimized. The con for the technique is that it is hard to master, takes a lot of time to learn and might be clunky, depending in the way it was trained. Riveting Knight spawned a throwing knife and used her same throwing method to send her knife piercing through a thick bush that was situated in the plains. The party heard a squeal before a boar waddled out of the bush with the knife in its eye, falling down in death. A person with the throwing knife technique has one advantage that the person with the skill would never possess. That is the ability to break through their limits. Skills are optimized to bring out the best effect within your stats and general character makeup. Techniques have nothing to do with stats, but your understanding and application. Of course, stats influence them, but not as much as they do skills. The key to this lies in balance. I cannot teach you this either, you'll have to learn what skills best suit you and develop or learn techniques on your own. Since techniques require more time, you need to acquire as many skills as possible while you can. Demand and supply in this game is ferocious. Skills that could be purchased now at reasonable prices would shoot up in the future. Do you understand? Part 5 of the series ends here. If you enjoyed it, please give us a like and subscribe so we can be motivated to make even better videos in the future.